Let's just check. It's going live. I'll give it a moment for YouTube. Yep, so that's us live. So, I, good evening or morning or afternoon or whenever this video is reaching you, whenever you're watching, whether you're watching live or afterwards. So this stream is going to be part one of what is called the American Ulysses, Soldier, President, Legend. In short, I'm going to be going from Grant's early life when he was born in 1822, 1822, all the way over to his death, all the way over to March 1864, wherein he gets promoted to Lieutenant General as a three-star general, and that's where he takes command of all Union armies. So I'm going to be going through. I'm going to be going through a few Mexican War battles that Grant took part in, as well as the Civil War battles between Belmont in November 1861, all the way up to the Chattanooga campaign, which is the last campaign he does before he gets promoted to Lieutenant General, and thereby replacing Henry Halleck, who up to that point was the commanding general after he took over from George B. McClellan, who fell out of favor with Lincoln after the 7 Days battles, as well as Antietam. Now, with this, I will. At first, I was in a bit of internal conflict as to whether to put in a piece of music. However, yeah, this is Grant. Whereas unlike Sherman, Grant was. I don't want to say triumphalist, but certainly he wasn't like Sherman, who had some sympathies towards the South, owing to living there, whereas Grant very much saw as his duty in the sense that, and as the war progressed, he became far more strong in his abolitionist beliefs. So I feel doing this song is apt. Just to give people some time to get to stream in, to start coming onto the stream, I'll play this song. I'll go for 2.5 minutes. I know it's probably, I generally like to avoid songs that are like very sort of boastful or sort of, boastful in the sense of insulting the other side, because my perspective is both sides have their validities as well as both sides have their downsides, to say the least. So this is, as far as like Union songs go, fairly innocuous, and it isn't like, for example, about Marching for Georgia song, for example, which I refuse to play when talking about William T. Sherman, because Sherman hated that song. So this feels apt, and I'll.
Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will rally from the hills and we'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor, up with the storm. When we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We are springing to the goal of our brothers gone before, shouting the battle cry of freedom, and we'll build a vacant ranks with 1,000,000 freemen more, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor, up with the storm. When we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We are marching to the field, boys, we're going to the fight, shouting the battle cry of freedom, and we bear the glorious stars for the Union and the right, shouting the battle cry of freedom. ready once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
Would have helped if I unmuted. Yeah, so that's the Battle Cry of Freedom, song which, unlike Marching for Georgia, isn't like one that's used by, well, it can be used by sort of more libtard type of people to sort of, well, I would say, like, rub it into the seven. It kind of takes on a partisan spirit. I don't feel either side embodied in the Civil War to the degree that average a lot of people today unfortunately embody. So that's my go-to song for Ulysses S. Grant, because there is a campaign song for him, which is just like 30 seconds, I believe, but it's a very repetitive song and it's not a very catchy song, I will say. So Battle Cry of Freedom it will be. Now, so with as this stream, as mentioned before, I will be covering between Ulysses S. Grant's early life. So, for example, you can see on screen I've got these are Ulysses S. Grant's parents, Jesse and Hannah. Now, Grant, let's just say he struggled in his relationship with his parents, mainly, for example, during the Civil War. There'll be anecdotes where, but sort of famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, General Orders Number 11, where Ulysses S. Grant trucks over Jews from the Mississippi area during the Civil War, as he's doing the Vicksburg campaign. One of the main reasons he does that order is because his father, Jesse, had come with a couple of Jewish merchants by the name of the Mack brothers to start dealing in cotton, which the problem with that was there's a lot of corruption within that. That's one reason why there's a sort of strained relationship between Ulysses and his father. It doesn't help, by the way, that Ulysses suffers a lot from failure up and between the Mexican War up until the American Civil War. Ulysses is not having a great time in life, to say the least, and in a way that kind of humanizes him to a degree that it allows him to see where the Confederate soldiers are coming from. When, for example, you have the famous surrenders of Vicksburg and Appomattox, where Grant makes a point of not rubbing in the wound against the South, because he understood how utterly devastating failure can seem to one's soul. So there's an element of one reason I'm doing Ulysses S. Grant, even though he is widely known, is because there is like this idea of Grant being a general who just bludgeoned his enemy to death with sheer numbers, which I don't like that argumentation, because it's not really true. He was quite adept in his generalship. As like, for example, one book I will be quoting from and using for this is J.F.C. Fuller's book, The Generalship of Ulysses S. Grant, which I would recommend for any military history buffs. And I'm also going to be going off his personal memoirs, as well as Ron Chernow's biography of Ulysses of Grant from 2017. There is a fourth book, but I'm not using it till next week, which is Gene Smith's dual biography of Lee and Grant, because it feels more apt to do that for part 2, because part 2 will include the Overland campaign, as well as the surrender at Appomattox, because very much it's a matter of, but it's very much like a titanic struggle between those two. And I would go so far as to say that, in my humble opinion, as an Englishman looking in, I just see Ulysses S. Grant as sort of the American Duke of Wellington. He was a far better soldier and general than he ever was a politician. But I don't want to crap on the man, but his presidency left a lot to be desired, because there's a lot of corruption, and Grant was a very trusting guy. So my view of Grant is going to be nuanced. Like, there's some things I like about him, and other things I'm not going to like about him. And those will be things I'll mention over this. So yeah, with Grant, he was born in a place called Point Pleasant out in southern Ohio, which is really on the border. I believe, I think it's on the border because technically West Virginia was a part of Virginia at the time in the 1820s. It was only in 1863 that West Virginia is carved out as a separate state. So Grant was born right on the border with Virginia. So from an early age, you can imagine he would have had some experience of slavery. Now, it's worth noting that he did always have sort of more abolitionist, or at least anti-slavery point of view, but he wasn't in favor of abolition until Abraham Lincoln is leading the war effort in the Civil War, because Grant, he very much sees it as a sectional issue that can tear the country apart. So he's a lot more pragmatic about it. His father, Jesse Grant, as you can see here, he grew up with John Brown in northern Ohio. So it's very much of a very small world. America's a big country, but small world, yeah. And this is a thing where Jesse Grant, he very much is, and this is one thing that father and son can agree on in the concept of Civil War, which is that they're both on the same side. Yeah, so yeah, Ulysses. He is a very he's a guy who grew in increments in regards to something like a slavery question, and also I would also say so one thing I can also resent is when, for example, when people talk about Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson, they always say, "Oh, well, those guys just went against really poor generals." Well, Grant had some really poor opposition in the Western theatre, as I will go through in this part one. And to my mind, I'm just thinking, well, that doesn't go against the grain of the man himself. Like Ulysses S. Grant, at the start of the American Civil War, was fairly amateurish. Like he never commanded troops before. I mean, he did serve in the Mexican War, like helping to raise up volunteers, like helping to inspire them with his horsemanship and so on. 'Cause one thing about Grant from the get-go is he is a damn good horseman, and that goes through his entire life. For example, in the Civil War, there are certain anecdotes about how good his horsemanship was that in ways inspired the men. For example, in his first battle at Belmont. But yeah, you have with Grant, it's a matter of he faced off against some poor opposition, and that taught him lessons he later learned. It's like in the same way that the Duke of Wellington could never face off against Napoleon at Waterloo the way he did without first getting experience through battles like Assaye or Salamanca or Vittoria or before that Busaco, etc. So this is one thing where this is a thing about the Civil War. Poor generalship in the early days of war was a rule rather than the exception. And Ulysses Grant, being the cream of the crop, he rises to the top. He does suffer. He does suffer a lot of internal politicking that goes against him, like Henry Halleck and George B. McClellan at one point actually scheming to get him arrested because they were claiming he was a drunkard. Well, the question of him being a drunkard is a nuanced one, to say the least. It's a very nuanced one because he had a guy called Rawlins on his staff who was very much acting like very much like an angel on his shoulder, who would often make sure he never drank to excess. He did drink at times, and he was a fair bit of a lightweight throughout his life. But in the context of a civil war, as well as whenever he was around his family, he never drank to excess at all. I don't think he ever drank at all to begin with, but he certainly was a lot more temperate. Sorry, mispronunciation. But whenever he was around his family, it was only when he was lonely or when he felt he had no purpose, such as what he felt in the 1850s after he left the army, that he really drank a lot, and it dogs him for the rest of his life. Rather unfortunately, I will say, like I said, Grant's a very nuanced guy, so that'll become a part. So without further ado, I'll get onto his life. So yeah, he's born in 1822, Ohio. Ohio is a state, but it's more like a frontier than not. Like you don't really have massive cities like what you do in Ohio today with Cleveland and Pittsburgh and so on. It's very much a matter of like it's a lot more rural compared to nowadays. And Ulysses Grant's family were no exception. He had a number of brothers, I believe he was the eldest, if I remember correctly, because he suddenly one thing that becomes a point of embarrassment for him later on is the fact that in the 1850s, before the Civil War, he's having to work as a clerk in his father's shop, junior to his own brothers who are younger than him. And this is when Grant is in his mid to late 30s. So there's an element of Grant, like he, as mentioned, he does go for a lot of failure in his life, and just as he does well, or at least does decently enough, yeah, someone will scam him, because this is one thing that I will go into. I will be repetitive on it. Grant is relentlessly trusting. Like, he's very assuming of people. He's very unassuming of people. That bites him in the arse many times over throughout his entire life. Not just in the civilian life, but also during the Civil War with generals like McClellan and Henry Halleck and George B. McClellan gunning for him, as well as William S. Rosecrans as well. But Rosecrans, it went both ways there compared to the others. So, yeah, that's the thing about Grant is he was, I'd say in ways he was too good. He was too kind for his own good dealing with people, and it allowed him to be taken for a ride. So yeah, so Grant he does go to a fee-paying school, but it's worth noting with rural America at this time, schooling was a bit on and off, to say the least. It was the quality of your education depended very much on the quality of your teacher, which can vary from absolute shockingly poor to outstandingly good, depending on the teacher you got. It was very variant in quality. It's not like in America now where, well, I would say the American education system today is not particularly a good one. Going out, I have few Americans I know online, compared to the grain who like know the history, but that's by the by. But yeah, I'll just say Grant, his family is kind of like, I'll say upper middle class, not upper middle class, upper working class / really lower middle class, because his father's more of a shop owner, and his family they're not particularly wealthy by any means, but they live comfortably enough so that they're not living in absolute poverty compared to, let's say, Stonewall Jackson, who had to deal with poverty in his youth, for example. And he's certainly not living in a great splendor that someone like Robert E. Lee got to live in his youth, owing to Lee's own aristocratic pedigree. So, yeah, so in a way, Grant, his family kind of embodies sort of the aspirations of the American dream. So yeah, so to get on to in 1840s, so he studies at West Point, and it's very much a matter of he does fairly well, especially in mathematics and physics. However, he barely passes in something like French, which is worth noting because West Point at this time taught exclusively Napoleonic tactics. Learning French was a must, and so you have someone like Robert E. Lee, for example, who never earned a single demerit for his entire time at West Point, and you got factor demerits at West Point. You get them for just not shining his shoes properly. So that kind of says you about Lee, but also with Grant, he got a fair few demerits, mainly because his French was barely passable, and it's an element of, well, it's you just do what you can and what you don't. So that's what happens at West Point for him. Now, one thing worth noting, at West Point, he does meet a fair few guys such as Braxton Bragg. He does come across other guys such as, I'm sorry, not Braxton Bragg. Braxton Bragg is later on in the Mexican War, especially at Battle of Monterrey. You have guys like James Longstreet, who I'm not 100% sure this is the case, but Ron Chernow's Grant certainly lays up the case that Longstreet was Grant's brother, best man at the wedding between him and Julia Dent after the Mexican War, which is worth noting. Longstreet and Grant's wife Julia were cousins, I believe, on the maternal side, if I remember correctly. So that's one thing that, for example, after the Civil War, Grant and Longstreet have a good friendship, which unfortunately leads to Longstreet getting a bad reputation, especially from the likes of Juba Early, who I don't know if I could do a stream about Juba early, but mainly because I'm biased against him, man, because I think he unfairly treated Longstreet, especially with for Gettysburg, which I'll probably and I do plan to do a stream on Gettysburg on July the 3rd. So that's one thing for people listening to keep an eye on in early July. I will do a stream on Gettysburg. I don't know if I'm going to have any guests on for that, but if someone like Duke or Alabaster or anyone else wants to join, they're free to. I mean, yeah, yeah. Longstreet gets a lot. I mean, on one hand, probably should have done a stream at Longstreet, but I might well do that in a later point in the year because I think I'm a fairly maligned guy, and he had a good friendship with Grant as well, which helped him after the war and helped him and Grant, very very much a matter of like this is just. It's not Winfield Scott Hancock. He had I think it was Armistead as a friend before the Civil War, and then Pickett's Charge happened, and those two guys only got to see each other briefly before Armistead passed from his wounds. So, it's just sort of a brutality of a civil war, I suppose, in terms of friendships and so on. Yeah, So with with Grant, he graduates from West Point in time for the Mexican War, and he served under Zachary Taylor, who, if you read Grant's personal memoirs, it's very much a matter of with Grant, he really looks up to Zachary Taylor. I mean, Zachary Taylor, he's very much a guy who he does his duty. He can have his reservations. For example, when James K. Polk becomes president as a Democrat, Zachary Taylor as a Whig isn't particularly fond of him, and Polk does scheme against guys like Taylor and Winfield Scott, who are also Whigs, which is the main unfortunate thing about the Mexican War was the two main generals in that war, Zachary Taylor in the north through Texas, and Winfield Scott going through Veracruz over to Mexico City. They're Whigs serving under a Democrat president who he's got his own political agenda in the Mexican War. So James K. Polk, very consequential president. Like he goes underrated in terms of how much of an impact he had with, and I think it's the single largest territorial expansion in American history, like the Mexican Cession. So under Zachary Taylor, Grant serves as a second lieutenant and serves, for example, if this loads, at the Battle of Palo Alto, which you can see here. This is Chaparral, which is like the low-level kind of scrub you get. And this is like, I believe this is in the area. I forget. I don't know if it's southwestern Texas yet, because the thing about because after the annexation of Texas in 1845, the border between America and Mexico was a bit skewy because you have a treaty of I forget the name of the treaty, but the treaty basically that enshrined Texan independence in 1836. The Texans claimed their border went up right up to between the Nueces and Rio Grande, which the thing is, it's a bit. I mean, Grant himself lays scorn on that because he says, well, Santa Anna, the defeated Mexican president and general, was held at gunpoint. Like he was hostage to the whims of the Texans at that point. But I just meant sour grapes, really. I mean, it's a matter of you lost the war, and you are subject to the condition of a victor. So yeah, and this is the thing with Grant is he doesn't like the Mexican War. He says so in his memoirs, where he says it's the most unjust war waged by a stronger power against a weaker power. Which I gotta be honest, I mean, this is one area where I can disagree with Grant on, like at least as an outsider anyway. I mean, if I was an American, I probably would see where it's coming from, but it's a matter of, well, especially in California, they had gold that was discovered in 1848, 49. Really fortunate that America took over California when they did, because if Mexico controlled it, they perhaps could have grown their economy with it, and then Mexico would have been a lot tougher adversary, because I think a Mexican war was inevitable. It was just manifest destiny was just on the cards, and well, I just see it as I'm thinking about Grant as well. He served as a second lieutenant in this war. even though he has his moral reservations about it, he still serves it anyway, which to me, that just says to me, well, there's no point in you morally complaining about it. So that's why, as I'm looking at granting this war on a moral level, I wouldn't have much time for him personally if I was serving alongside him in terms of constantly sort of complaining about how unjust he felt the war to be. Because, well, you go against the power when they're weak, and Santa Anna, I mean, Santa Anna was an incompetent general, and Mexico was corrupt and really just run ramshackle. It wasn't a very well governed country, so I don't blame the Americans at all for taking all that land. To be honest, I would have done the same in the American position. That's just the law of the world. So yeah, Palo Alto. I mean, there's not much to be said about this battle, as you can see with choose dispositions here. Even though, yeah. And the thing about the Mexicans, they do have artillery and cavalry and so on, but as you can see here, you got Zachary. Sorry, that's not Zachary Taylor. That's General Arisa. Sorry. You got the Mexicans. Sorry. They've got more troops in reserve and so on. However, the American troops under Zachary Taylor, they are far better in quality. I could do a stream in depth about the Mexican War, to be honest, but let's just say the Mexicans, they have substandard weapons because going back, they still use them India pattern Brain Best musket, and they're using poor quality gunpowder. Their cannons can only fire a solid shot, so while the American cannons can fire exploding shots and canisters, the Mexican guns can only do solid shots. So the Mexicans, it really is just a matter of they're outclassed in everywhere. The infantry can't do very well because they're not well trained nor well led. That's the main problem with the Mexican army was they just didn't have good leadership at all. At least of all Santa Anna. So Palo Alto, that it was a rather slam dunk battle. So it was just sheer quality compared to a Mexican army that while outnumbering Taylor's forces, they were not in a good position. To say the least, they were just the Mexicans were always on the back foot. I would say throughout this war, regardless of numbers. After Palo Alto, you have a battle of Risaca de la Palma, which, if people recognize the name Risaca, that was also the name of a battle on the Atlanta campaign between Sherman and Johnston, Joseph E. Johnston, which I mentioned last week. This is one thing where certain battlefields, like certain towns you get in the South, are named after battles in the Mexican War. Risaca in Georgia being one of them. So Risaca de la Palma, which, as you can see, you've got these are like pools of water almost, and you've got these narrow ports of entry. So Zachary Taylor, he's coming in from this direction, and he's largely fighting against the Mexican army. Only has like a few ports of entry to get into, and you've got thick chaparral here around here, so you can't easily outflank at first anyway. The Mexicans, they hold up for a time, dealing in this dense scrub and whatnot, as well as these natural choke points. However, I believe in the lighter chaparral, there was like a Mexican battery, like what I would say battery was only with one or two guns, with like a small cavalry escort and a small company of infantry around here. They get routed by Buchanan's force, which is like a detachment under Zachary Taylor's command. And because of that, the Mexicans, they then see that, okay, Buchanan then can flank around here, and the Mexicans see fit to pull back because they know full well they can't stand if their flanks are exposed. So there's not much to be said about Risaca de la Palma here. And as you can see here, it's clearer here, very flat terrain as well. So the superior firepower of the American forces as well is really telling as well. It's just wasn't good ground for the Mexicans. Then you have here the Battle of Monterrey, which this is from Ulysses S. Grant's personal memoirs. So you have, for example, this is a Bishop's Palace here by the Sotilla Road. B, you got here's a Black Fort. C is a central plaza, like the sort of town square. Here, you got a row of batteries around here on the Rio San Juan de Monterrey, or the River St. John of Monterrey. Monterrey, of course, meaning King's Mountain. in Spanish. This is really when you get into Mexico itself now. It's not even within the contemporary territory anymore of what we consider America and Texas. You're now into northern Mexico. Now, General Taylor goes down this road, and he has to separate into a number of columns. Like, for example, the Black Fort, you have Garland, who he has to move over to this road because he's meant to go over. I'll reroute around here towards the Sortilla Road. Garland, however, he neglects to make sure his men are not within range of his Black Fort. So the heaviest casualties at the Battle of Monterrey are very much suffered by Garland just ramming roughshod with his men and not caring too much for the Mexican firepower at the fort. So meanwhile, Ulysses S. Grant, there were times where during the battle they're storming into the town of Monterrey itself, especially here in Citadel, as well as the Plaza, which is the most thickly fortified area within the town. Of course, where you got the rooftops being flat, and you got loads of. It's a very ugly battle as well. It's urban warfare with muskets. Similar, it's kind of like foreboding, akin to the Battle of Fredericksburg, between Ambrose Burnside and Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in 1862. So very sort of ugly battle. Grant himself had to personally speed on his horse because there were times where the troops would be storming into the town and they wouldn't have ammunition. So Grant has to wheel over to the rear and get ammunition. And this is where Grant, he starts to really get noticed by Zachary Taylor, because not only is he calm under fire, but also he's really good at keeping the volunteers on side. He's very good at making sure because it's worth noting the American armies of this time, half of them were volunteers, and the other half regulars. It has to be that way because in the American Civil War, in the early days, you see what happens when you got most of the army being volunteers. It's the fact that panic is easily given, troops are easily routed, and discipline. It takes time for discipline to set in. Whereas in the Mexican War, an army, for example, Zachary Taylor's or Winfield Scott's, being half regulars at least, means that discipline is a lot more kept in place. And then regulars are able to teach your volunteers a thing or two. So it's a kind of a best of all worlds. The volunteers have superior drive, and also, they're driven to win the war. But also the regulars are there to make sure that they don't desert, because a lot of these volunteers do get disappointed when the war doesn't go the way they originally thought it should go. So you have in the case of Ulysses S. Grant, he serves here. Later on in the Mexican War, he serves in Winfield Scott's army, marching upon Mexico City, where at a place called the San Cosme Gate, which is like southern part of Mexico City. There's an anecdote where, so the troop, because the San Cosme Gate is an actual choke point, Grant, he has to think outside the box, but he works harder, not smarter. So what he does is he finds there's a bell tower behind the Mexican lines. So what he does is he gets a few men, as well as I think it's like an 18-pounder. So they get this 18-pounder. I mean, they say to this priest in the church with a bell tower. It says, like, where they say with what little Spanish they know, say, look, we need access to your bell tower so we can take this cannon upstairs. And they have to piece it apart and then reassemble it upstairs. So what they do is they then reassemble this 18-pounder artillery gun atop of this bell tower and then fire down on the Mexicans who are defending San Cosme Gate right outside Mexico City. The Mexicans are so shocked by this 18-pounder striking around behind their rear, and they're so shocked they don't even bother trying to send out some troops to take care of Grant and his men. So Winfield Scott's men were able to go through the San Cosme Gate in a shock assault, and the Mexican garrison at said gate, they just surrendered on the spot because they were so spooked by Ulysses S. Grant flanking them and hitting them in the rear with an artillery shot. So that helps to serve as sort of a precursor to what Grant later becomes known for in terms of thinking inside. He can think inside a box. He does have this very intuitive grasp of warfare, which James C. Fuller compliments him on in his book, talking about his generalship, where he says someone like Henry Halleck, as I mentioned later on, he's a lot more bookish, whereas Grant is a lot more instinct driven, and this is kind of like a precursor to that. So, the Mexican War, you have Mexico City occupied. The government has fallen apart because Santa Anna is removed from power. Like he's hopeless, and so it really was just a matter of we had to make a provisional government on the fly right outside Mexico City to sign a treaty called Guadalupe Hidalgo, where America takes over states like Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada. There's a bit of Arizona that later gets purchased in 1853, the Gadsden Purchase. But aside from that, that's where the contiguous United States gets a southern border from. This particular Mexican War, very much of a slam dunk war. It's when you look at it, even though Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott had to do with some fairly difficult circumstances. As I could do with doing a stream or two about the Mexican War. So it's a very interesting war, certainly because, for example, at Monterrey, it wasn't just that you had Ulysses S. Grant there. You also had, I believe, Braxton Bragg and James Longstreet, among others. Whereas a lot of the Confederate generals served with Winfield Scott, such as Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and George E. Pickett, among others. So it's very much sort of baptism of fire for many a Civil War general. So I'll breeze through in a few minutes what happens. So after the Mexican War, so Grant, he gets stationed over to garrison duty in the western states, western territories, I should say. Although California becomes a state a few years after the war because the gold rush brings a load of people, and it becomes a state, very sharpish. It becomes a garrison area, and a lot of the people he was going to serve garrison with, because they had to go on a ship to Panama and then take a ship on the Pacific coast of Panama up to the Pacific coastline of America. A lot of people died of malaria on the way, and they reckon this is one reason why Grant drinks a lot at this part of his life, because he saw so many. It wasn't just men, but it was also women and children, like the women and children of a lot of the men who Grant served with. So it was very much of a. This is one reason why they reckon Grant started drinking, and when you look at that, you go, I don't blame him for drinking at that point. And it's worth noting as well, garrison duty being incredibly boring. Grant wasn't anyone special in terms of his drinking. I mean, compared to others, he might as well be teetotal. Like there were many guys on the garrison duties out west who drank far more than Grant. So this is one thing where I think people are unfair, in my personal opinion, towards Grant in terms of his drinking. I think, if anything, I just see it as a matter of, well, Grant, he was just doing what many others of his time were doing in terms of a drinking. So in 1854, he leaves the army because I forget the name of the commanding officer from the top of my head, but basically they had problems where Grant was caught drunk on duty one time, and this general commanding over him basically said to him, "Look, I don't want to say general, I should say commanding officer." This officer says to Grant, "Look, if you don't shape up soon with your drinking, I will force you to leave the army." And it's at that point Grant, he decides to leave the army, and his wife Julia Dent Grant, at this point I should say, because they're married not long after the Mexican War ended. So Julia very much supports her husband doing this, and Grant goes all over the place. Like, for example, he goes over to New York at one point where he's in debt, and he's also got he's also got problems financially because he'd been scammed out of some of his money. I forget the name of a guy again who scammed him, but this becomes a common occurrence in Grant's life. He keeps getting scammed and taken advantage of. So a guy called Simon Bolivar Buckner, who later is the general at Fort Pillow. I mean, not Fort Pillow, Fort Donelson, out of a siege, who ended up surrendering to Grant later on. That Buckner gives money to help Grant, and yeah, and Grant for a time he tried to get into stuff like farming, but that fell through, and in the end, he had to go cap in hand to his own father in 1858 or 59, if memory serves him right, to basically work his own father's shop, where he has to be junior to his own brothers, who are all younger than him. So it's really a matter of, it's a low point in his life, and it's only really with a civil war breaking out that he really gets that sort of release of energy, because he got that sense of purpose once more. Like the war is shaping up now, and at first, like he applies to become George B. McClellan's to be on George B. McClellan's staff out of the East, but McClellan just spurns him. So he's down on his luck for a bit. However, in the state of Illinois, Governor Yates spots Grant and puts him in charge of the 21st Illinois Regiment, and it's from that point on that Grant takes charge of a force for the first time. And I think because it's worth noting, before the war, he was living in a place called Galena, Illinois. So that's how Grant was able to be recruited by the Illinois state governor. It's also worth noting that because he was a soldier at that time, he couldn't vote in the 1860 election. And Grant said himself in his personal memoirs, at least in Ron Chernow's biography of Grant, that if Grant was able to vote in 1860, he would have never voted for Lincoln, because he believed that Lincoln, him being elected, would lead to a civil war, which turned out to be vindicated. So what happened then was you then have so then Grant, he said if he was able to vote, he would have voted for the Northern Democrat ticket under Stephen A. Douglas. He was far more of a let sleeping dogs lie kind of electoral ticket. Just don't bother opposite him at apple cart too much. Of course, Lincoln gets in, and well, you get Fort Sumter and all the rest of it. Yes, so Civil War breaks out. Grant takes control of the 21st Illinois Regiment. He has to deal with some insubordination and ill discipline on the part of the troops, but he's easily able to whip them into shape soon thereafter. And yeah, before long, he ends up commanding a brigade in time for Battle of Belmont on November 7th, 1861. So one thing you can see is you got the Mississippi River. You have state of Kentucky here, because it's worth noting that up until Leonidas Polk taking over Columbus, as you can see here, along the Kentucky coastline to the Mississippi, Kentucky declared neutrality, and Grant, as well as other Union generals, they did respect it for a time until Leonidas Polk breached it, and then later on, Kentucky ends up siding with the Union because of Polk's sort of impatience and rush to occupy advantageous positions along the Mississippi. So you have here, you got a place called Camp Johnston. What happens is they have like a battle around here nearby the cornfields, and then steadily over the course of a battle over the next few hours, they just progressively chase them for this densely wooded territory. You do have some. The only real clearing is this cornfield here, for example, as well as this little pool of water. I don't even can consider it a lake. So you have here, you just have like this densely forested area, which makes the combat fairly confusing. However, because of Grant's leadership in this battle, the Union troops don't do badly at all. And once they get to the camp, this is where the ill discipline of the troops gets at Grant, because instead of pursuing their advantage and destroying the Confederate force, they instead just plunder the camp. And Grant has a resort to burning the camp itself to get them to focus on the job. So yeah, this is where Grant, for example, this is one area where he shines through is his fortitude, because one thing that Grant makes sure he never does is he never risks himself on the line of battle like other generals do. Like, for example, you have famously Stonewall Jackson, who gets killed by his own men at Chancellorsville, whereas Grant, he makes sure, like, he knows his own responsibility isolates him from his men. So he makes sure that he never stays close enough to the front line to be unfortunately shot. And he's also got the fortitude to carry on his advantage. He's got the instinct to carry on his advantage. It's not like, for example, George B. McClellan, where he beats off Joseph E. Johnston at 7 points and then doesn't pursue the advantage after the battle, or doesn't pursue the enemy after their disorganization from the battle. Instead, Grant carries on the attack. And were it not for his troops plundering, Gideon Pillow's troops would have been annihilated, and they would have been forced to surrender. But you have a ferry boat who later come in with troops under Leonard's Polk coming to reinforce Gideon Pillow's men. And just as Grant, because it was around here, Gideon Pillow's men were, as they were preparing to cross back across into Columbus, Polk's men land around here and then may strike the rear of Grant's forces around here. And of course, if there's anything that really destroys the momentum of ill-disciplined troops having a victorious moment, it's a rear attack. So it's only through Grant remaining cool and calm that his army doesn't disintegrate. And this is why when you look at the casualties, it's something like I think there's only like 100 men disparity between the casualties, or 200, between 100 and 200 in favour of the Union. Mainly the thing was, ill discipline on the part of the Union troops on the ground, as well as this unexpected ambush around here. But other than that, I would classify this as a victory, certainly in the sense that it helps Grant to recognise where he needs to improve the army, mainly in terms of discipline for later on. And as you can see, Belmont, this is like southeastern Missouri along the Mississippi. So yeah, it's very much a baptism of fire for Grant. So yeah, as you can see, this is like state of Missouri around here, southeastern here. After this, he then occupies Paducah. Not long after, and then and then you have. When you have, for example, you got Pope around here, New Madrid, or New Madrid, apparently. Apparently, Americans pronounce Madrid. I'm just comparing it to Madrid because I don't live in that part of America, obviously, and I just know it as the Spanish capital city kind of name. So if I pronounce I'd say to any American watching, don't hesitate to correct me if I'm pronouncing these place names right or wrong, because I know, for example, I believe that you have, for example, this place. I used to pronounce it as Cairo, but apparently it's pronounced Cairo by people local to the area. So yeah, it might well be that I'm wrong. Might well be that it is pronounced Cairo, and I'm none the wiser. So if people wish to correct me, don't hesitate. So yeah, you have Kentucky now declaring in with the Union, and this is only the real battle that you have in 1861 for Grant, obviously, because, well, yeah, it's just a matter of what you have with Grant here. This time of the war, so late 1861, not much fighting happens because both sides are training up their forces. Both sides are trying to place their armies for better strategic advantage, which is why Kentucky has a neutrality breached in by both sides, pretty much. So yeah, as you get into February, you get Grant commanding troops in for the sieges of Fort Henry and Donelson. So yeah, I forgot to share this one earlier. So this is Grant at the time of the Mexican War. This is Grant around the time of the Battle of Belmont. As you can see, his beard is a lot longer compared to what we usually see of him. And this is an obscure photo that isn't really people don't really think of when we think of Grant, because they largely think of this Grant, where, for example, he's a 3-star general here as a lieutenant general. And one thing about Grant is, so for his entire life, he was known. Like, I mean, he's only 5'8". However, yeah, he's only like 5'8". You think like he looks puny here, but I mean, apparently he was known to be quite a robust young guy, to say the least. Yeah, so it goes without saying that with Grant, it's very much it's similar to Napoleon in the sense that people thought Napoleon looks puny and weak, but actually it turned out to be a real legend in his own right. So yeah, so this is the thing. Yeah, as you get here, the Kentucky-Tennessee border, you got Camp Halleck up here, and you get around into early February, into mid-February, you get Grant. There's Fort Hyman here, which is occupies high ground that overlooks Fort Henry. There's not much to be said about these two forts. I mean, Fort Hyman falls fairly quickly, as does Fort Henry. I mean, Fort Henry literally falls to the Navy. And the fact is, with Fort Henry, the Madrid, American pronunciation is really weird compared to European pronunciation. That's all I will say. So, that's all I will say. But yeah, you have Grant after Fort Henry's taken. It's just by the Navy, because Tilghman, who was a Confederate commander of his fort, he had around 1,200 men, but 1,100 he detaches and sends over to Fort Donelson, because he knows Fort Henry isn't going to hold, and he has only 100 men to try and hold up a place as much as possible, because he knows for why he can't hold it with 1,200, let alone 100. But yeah, so he lessens the blow and sends a men to Fort Donelson, which is fortunate because they don't get captured. But unfortunately, Fort Donelson, as mentioned in previous streams, especially at Nathan Bedford Forest ones, Fort Donelson does fall. But anyway, yeah. So you have two roads here: the Telegraph Road and the Ridge Road, where you have C.F. Smith. Now, C.F. Smith, it's as an anecdote. So C.F. Smith, it's worth noting that I think around this time or just after, certainly at the time of Shiloh, Grant is very uneasy about commanding C.F. Smith, because C.F. Smith is not only older than him, but is actually senior to him in rank. However, Grant is the one in overall command as dispatched by Halleck. And C.F. Smith spends his time just reassuring Grant, look, I know your quality. I have no problem serving underneath you. And yeah, that's one thing about Grant is, he constantly had some sort of insecurity around commanding a guy who was senior to him, not just rank, but also age as well. McClernand, this guy I will go into more detail later, but let's just say he's a ladder climbing backstabber. Like, certainly, a lot of the stories you get about Grant being drunk throughout the Civil War either come from him or two other guys called, I think Kuntz, I think his name was, or Kuntz. I think it's Kuntz, Kountz. It's a German name. I'm assuming it's pronounced Kuntz because that's how the Americans, I imagine, would pronounce it. And then a third guy, William S. Rosecrans, who, to be fair, Grant did rile him up, so it's kind of like it went both ways, compared to McClernand, who was just a ladder climbing backstabber. And it takes a long while for Grant to get rid of him, though, because it's worth noting McClernand was an Illinois Democrat. He was a friend of President Lincoln. So for a long time, McClernand is sticking him a lot of clap around. Sticks him a lot of bullet clap, and he's just a massive pain in the arse for Grant up until June 1863, during the siege of Vicksburg. That's only when McClernand gets removed. But yeah, in the meantime, McClernand sticks him in like a bloody bad penny. And yeah, one thing that happens on the march, so you have some warm weather, and the troops stupidly, permitted by the officers, they discard all their winter clothing. So when they're besieging Fort Donelson later on, especially on February the 13th, the weather turns cold, and they now wish they had all those blankets and winter clothing. So yeah, very much of a matter of sort of, I don't want to say Schadenfreude, but certainly a sense of, well, you can sort of laugh a bit there. As you can see, also you got the reserve under Lew Wallace is dispatched from February 14th over a Telegraph Road. So siege of Fort Donelson. It's worth noting that, as mentioned before, you have Fort Donelson. You got a water battery here, which fends off Federal gunboats on the 14th. This is the thing where Grant, he's very good at working with the Navy, and the Navy become a very important asset in the war because one thing you see in the Western Theatre was all the battles and all the strategic maneuvering happen either over rivers, such as the Mississippi and Tennessee and Cumberland, such as what you see here, or it happens over railways. Without doubt, they always happen over. I must think this is where Grant shines through as a strategist. Is that not just here, but also throughout the war, he sees the strategic initiative from the outset. So, for Donelson, for example, down in Cumberland towards as it flows down here, it goes down to Nashville. So if you take Fort Donelson, Nashville is up for grabs. And yeah, so you have C.F. Smith here. You got Grant's headquarters on the other side of Hickman Creek. In the center, you got General Lew Wallace, and on the right, you got McClernand. On February 15th, you have a Confederate attack that happens where they sally out to go against McClernand on the right. Now, this attack went swimmingly well. The only issue was, as they were so successful, Gideon Pillow especially, as well as John B. Floyd, they just paralyze themselves with indecision. They don't know what to do because they think it's too good to be true to be this successful. And so they just go back into the fort. And their opportunity to escape, because you've got this Clarksville Road, which Albert Johnston said to the garrison commanders, John B. Floyd and Gideon Pillow especially, do not get bottled up in Fort Donelson. If you can, escape and join my army, because we need every man we can get to face off against Grant. And Halleck, of course, is in charge of the Western Theatre. John B. Floyd really is no soldier or general at all. He was the Secretary of War under the previous administration under James Buchanan, and as mentioned in Grant's personal memoirs, Grant wants this guy because the thing was he was found to be stockpiling weapons in the South, so that in the event of secession and later on the Civil War, those weapons are easily seized by Southern garrisons. So John B. Floyd, when in the Council of War, the garrison in Fort Donelson, they make their move to surrender. John B. Floyd and Gideon Pillow, they're making sure they get the heck out of Dodge. While Simon Bolivar Buckner, he's the one who has to hold the buck. Just as another thing, so this attack on the Union right, it was a matter of Grant was very calm and collected here as well, where what happened was, you see here, he gets General Smith to attack because he knows full well that, okay, the Confederates, in order to attack McClernand, had to weaken their right flank. So General Smith attacks. Meanwhile, Wallace and McClernand, they form up a defensive line around here and then counter-attack later on once they've recovered their positions, once they've recovered their morale and psychological condition. This is where, Grant, especially, he's the one rallying them, saying, men, we cannot allow them escape. We must fight them and force them back into the fort. It's not the most inspirational of speeches, but it does the effect. Well, inspirational in the sense of, it does inspire them. It does inspire the men. Because this is the thing that Grant, of course, is that he's kind of like the Belisarius of the Union Army, in that he's not an ambitious guy. He's not like a Napoleon or an Alexander the Great, where he he's going to furnish his own reputation and try to be the quote unquote Billy Big Bollocks, should we say, of all this. He's all about getting a job done. He's not out there to get a flashy career. He's not out there to get a crap load of medals. He's there to get the job done. And this is one reason why Lincoln and Grubb still really like him later on in the war, because he's not like George B. McClellan, who was a war Democrat and had political ambitions after the war. Yeah, and Grant, it's another thing he learns here is, again, he learns the importance of adaptability, because originally the plan was to just starve out Fort Donelson and try to get the Navy to help bombard and force the fort to surrender. With this attack, however, he speeds it up and he cuts off their escape, and the fort ends up falling anyway. So while the plan might change, the overall intention of a plan itself doesn't change, and that becomes a feature for Grant's campaigns. So yeah, you have Fort Donelson surrendering on February the 16th, which is why, for example, you have Forrest, for example, he gets a heck of dodge because he's not going to stick around. So this is John B. Floyd, who was the first guy in charge of the fort, and let's say, he was a complete coward. He just took tail and ran as soon as surrender was agreed upon option. You got Gideon Pillow, who thought he was God's gift, and after this, he doesn't hold I don't think he holds a senior command again after this, because Jefferson Davis was done with him. I mean, you got Simon Bolivar Buckner, the same Buckner, as mentioned earlier, who lent Grant money back when Grant was living penniless in New York. And it's really a matter of, like, you do look at Grant, where he says basically no terms of unconditional and total surrender. Total and unconditional surrender will be the only terms you get. I propose to move immediately upon your works. Buckner says, "Oh well, these are on chivalrous terms," which, well, I would say boo-hoo, like that's war. Grant was there to do a job, and he was there to speed up a war, ending as soon as possible. Unconditional surrender just happened to be the best way to do it in that scenario, and this is where the U.S. part of Ulysses S. Grant becomes an unconditional surrender grant, as his nickname for the Civil War. Because I forgot to mention earlier, West Point. So Ulysses S. Grant was born as Hiram Ulysses Grant, but he hated the fact that his name spelled hug in initials, so he changed it to Ulysses Grant. But while he was at West Point, they changed it name to Ulysses S. Grant, because the implication was the S, like they put an S because they thought his middle name would be his mother's maiden name, Simpson, because that was a common occurrence in most days, where you'd have a lad given his first name, the middle name would be the mother's maiden name, and then surname be the father's surname. That was a common occurrence, and Grant tried to correct it so many times during West Point, but, well, it just stuck, and he just went along with it. Or not being cavalier is actually his strength. Every lesson learned the hard way, but it's fully learned. Yeah, this is the thing. I mean, it's, in much the same. I mean, J.F.C. Fuller, for example, in his book, he would often compare the First World War to the American Civil War, in the sense that guys like Douglas Haig, they have to learn the hard way how to wage a war in a winning formula, because you get battles like the Somme, which become a bloodbath, in much the same way that battles like Chickamauga and Antietam become bloodbaths, because one thing a lot of Union generals just don't do is they don't synchronize their forces. They don't try to do fully coordinated assaults on Confederate positions, which you think to yourself, that's a basic military principle. It's like, when you're going to attack the enemy, ultimately you want to have a synchronized assault. You don't attack piecemeal, but it's not until Grant takes over that really that lesson is learned, and it takes 3 years for the Union to fully learn it in its depth. So yeah, it's a matter of both sides really having to learn a lot of lessons the hard way. And this is a problem with the. I mean, this is the same with the English Civil War as well. Like, the English Civil War is even worse because at least with the American Civil War, you did have professional army officers. In the English Civil War, you didn't even have that. Like you just had some guys who read Gustavus Adolphus about Gustavus Adolphus's campaigns, but reading is one thing and doing it in practicality is another. So that's just the nature of warfare, especially for something like this, where the vast majority of the officers and the generals are guys who, before the war, weren't generals at all and had to learn everything on the fly. Because, as I said, someone like Ulysses S. Grant, by the time the Civil War happens, I mean, yeah, he did go to West Point, but that was years ago, and he's probably a bit out of practice with his military theory. So instinct becomes more his guide for this, rather than sort of a more bookish way of learning. It's like it's similar to how I can play a Total War game that teaches me more about warfare than reading a book, because I can read about Ulysses S. Grant through his personal memoirs, but until you play a game like Ultimate General Civil War, which I've got, which is a game I'd recommend for anyone interested in the Civil War, American Civil War. Yeah, it's really through games like that you learn more about the difficulties of campaigning and warfare of this time, more than reading it in a book. So yeah, these are the two maps. Yeah, so February 13th. Yeah, you have battles around here. Yeah, and then you get February 14th. Yeah, so Fort Donelson surrenders on the 16th, and yeah, this is where Albertine Johnston is forced to abandon Nashville, which is a big punch in the balls for the Confederates because Nashville was the state capital of Tennessee, of course. So big propaganda loss for the Confederate side to be losing a state capital very early on in the war. So yeah. So one thing worth noting, a Pittsburgh Landing around here, which is on the which is along the Tennessee River. This was actually discovered by accident by Sherman, because the thing was, they were planning on marching to Corinth, but the thing was, but Halleck, being a guy of military principle and very much a guy who goes by the book, and really this is where James C. Fuller, he's very scathing towards Halleck in his book about Grant, because he calls him a witless pedant, which I don't know if I'd go that far, but I would certainly say he was too pedantic for his own good. Like he certainly was too much of a bookish kind of general. For example, Grant had said after Fort Donelson, right, we could have marched down to Corinth, or indeed, as I'll mention later, after Shiloh, they could have marched on it. But Halleck is a master of procrastination, and there are many missed opportunities. And this is the thing, like one thing about like Halleck is the fact that he very much is on. Even though George B. McClellan hates him, those two are a lot more similar than people realize, in the sense that, well, they're both procrastinating, they're both much more by the book kind of guys, and what's more, they're extremely cautious to the point it paralyzes the momentum of the army. Because it's like Frederick the Great would say, as would Ulysses S. Grant, to advance is to conquer. And certainly with the Union side of the Civil War, they had to advance, because that's just the nature of war. They had to enforce total surrender on the South, and you can't do that by defending all the time or just staying stationary. This is where Grant and Sherman and Wallace and Hurlbut Prentice and so on, they stick around Pittsburgh Landing. Now, one thing about this battlefield, it's very good ground to defend because it's densely forested. It doesn't really show it here on this map. I don't know if it shows on another map. I think it shows more on this map. Yeah, you have, for example, you have some clearings, like few fields here and there, but it's densely forested. For example, if you read Shelby Foote or listen to Shelby Foote, at least, one thing Shelby Foote says is how with Shiloh you could go from one end of a battlefield to another without stepping in sunlight. Like it was flickering. This was April, of course, so all the trees have got their leaves in the spring, and what's more, yeah, and also the Union forces were more on the top of a slope. So as the Confederates advance later in the battle, they got like it's a matter of people say the Confederates lost it because of Albert Sidney Johnston getting killed at 2:30 p.m. on the first day. I think as at first that was my opinion as well, but as I study the battle more in detail, the more I realised, yeah, there was no way Charlotte was going to be won by the Union. I mean, sorry, by the Confederates. No way. In the way they was. I mean, the thing was, the Confederates were actually slowed down by rain in the lead up to the battle. They were slowed down by rain, as well as one of Braxton Bragg's divisions getting lost along the way because of poor maps or something along those lines. So yeah, it's really just a matter of if, for argument's sake, because you got April 5th here, had they attacked on the 5th on April 5th, Grant loses, and it's worth noting as an additional note, at this time, Henry Halleck and George B. McClellan were actually scheming to get Grant sacked, and had it not been for the victory at Shiloh, Grant would have been sacked. So I would say Shiloh, in very much, is a very underrated battle in terms of importance, because if Grant had lost it, he would have been sacked, and we would never be hearing of Grant again after this. We'd be hearing of him as a disgraced general who lost the battle because he didn't. Because one thing Grant doesn't do at this is he doesn't fortify his position. He didn't entrench his forces. He gives off his reasons in the personal memoirs as well. He needs to make sure his troops are readily drilled and trained. Which after what I mentioned earlier, the Battle of Belmont, where the Union troops nearly lost the battle altogether because of ill discipline, I'm willing to give Grant a lot more slack. And it's not just that, because of how advantageous Pittsburgh Landing was as a defensive ground. I have to say I don't really penalise Grant all that much for not hunkering down in trenches. Although I will say, people say digging trenches demoralises the men, and it's like, well, this is. I just see it as well. It's more demoralising to lose, so I don't like. So I don't get that excuse. Well, that Sherman. I mean Sherman. Well, Sherman does give it, but also Grant as well as his commanding general at this particular battle. So yeah, they hold up at Pittsburgh Landing while they're waiting for Don Carlos Buell, Army of Ohio, to join them. So yeah. So as you can see here, yeah, you got Claiborne, you got Hardy, for example, he charges for the center. Yeah. Yeah, so this is oh bloody hell, I'm getting disorganized a bit here, aren't I? Yeah, sorry. So this, yeah. Oh, sorry, I got slightly confused. Yeah, so between 5 and 6 a.m. So really, when it's dawn, Hardy and Bragg, they're attacking the Union Center. As you can see, this is Sherman's main camp. Sherman was somewhere around here, I believe, where he was scared, like because he saw some skirmishers. He thought it was just like a raid or something, and then he gets shot in the hand by some of Claiborne's skirmishers, and as a side note on Claiborne, I might well do a stream about him. I might well get around to doing a stream about him in 2 weeks' time, because I think he's a very underrated general, and he doesn't really. I've only got one book about him because there's not much written about him. Although Shelby Foote and other historians will say Claiborne really goes under the radar for being a very capable general, and yeah. Bloody hell. Oh, bloody hell. Where am I? So, yeah, you have this obviously Albert Sidney Johnston, and then second in command, PGT Beauregard, who famously commanded the First Battle of Bull Run. So yeah, I said yeah, you have Albert Sidney Johnston. He commands up until 2:30 p.m. where he gets accidentally shot by his own men, and he bleeds to death because he's got nerve damage done to his hip from a previous duel, like 20 years or so before Shiloh. So that's where that's why Albert Sidney Johnston gets killed for what he does, where they don't even know where he was actually shot until it's too late. So yeah. Yep. So as you can see, you got Shiloh Church around here, and you got Sherman and McClernand on the right, dealing with mainly Braxton Bragg, but also elements of Hardy's men. And yeah, you've got W.H.L. Wallace in the centre, behind Prentice. I believe around here is where you have a Hornet's Nest, which aptly named, to say the least, because it really was just a matter of the two sides bloodily they bludgeoned each other just with sheer loads of men, to the point where Prentice's men later on in the day they surrender because they run out of ammunition. But yeah, it's a matter of Shelby Foote would describe this battle as being like 1,000 small skirmishes all happening in conjunction to one another. And by the end of the battle, I think what happened was so many Confederate casualties on the field that you can actually go from one end from a battlefield to another without stepping on the ground at all. Such was the heavy density of fallen men in the battle. It was a bloodbath for both sides, to say the least. So yeah, when you get to noon, you got Sunken Road here, you got Prentice and W.H.L. Wallace. You also got Stewart. Stewart, of course, is under the command of Sherman on the left flank. You got Breckinridge, who commands a reserve corps. And yeah, you got Hardy dealing with Sherman and McClernand, as well as Polk here, also in the centre alongside Bragg. And yeah, it's really just a very ugly battle. And you get, and as mentioned here, you have a Hornet's Nest here, which for the rest, for you get here, as mentioned here, you get General Johnston. He's mortally wounded here at 2:30 p.m. Yeah. So by the end of the first day, the Union Army force here, Lew Wallace, he actually comes in. He was late to the battle by a day because a whole lot of rigmarole happens. Basically, he misunderstands the maps, and well, he arrives a day late. And Grant is furious with him, but nevertheless is here. And Lew Wallace is to be the vanguard for the counterattack the next day, because Sherman the previous night on as Buell's coming in crossing Tennessee with his men, 30,000 Army of Ohio. Grant and Sherman, they actually have like a small chat where Sherman says to Grant, "We've had the devil's own luck today, haven't we?" And Grant says, "Yes, lick him tomorrow though." So yeah, you understand where where Grant really gets his sort of cool and calm reputation from you. And I must think, like, I remember reading one book about Nathan Bedford Forrest by Wyeth. He wrote in his book about Forrest in 1898, where he said, even if Buell didn't come in to reinforce, Grant probably would have counterattacked anyway, because at this point, I don't know if he knew for certain, but he did. But he probably suspected that at the very least, the Confederate momentum had been completely shattered by the death of their General Johnston. Like it was beginning to become common knowledge among the troops, and PGT Beauregard now takes over command. Although, as someone like Forrest later finds out, a lot of the officers on the ground they don't realise until too late, and it's really just a matter of command and control become a nightmare. It was already a nightmare in there because of terrain, but yeah. So the counterattack that happens, and you see here 5 a.m., then 11 a.m., and then between 12 and then into noon, and then as it gets dark, you're having to get Breckinridge covering, and then here you got around here you get fallen place called Fallen Timbers, where famously Nathan Bedford Forrest holds up Sherman's forces, and where he gets famously shot, but survives. Drummer Boy of Charlotte, very famous story. Yeah, I'm trying. My mind's gone blank a bit, but I'm trying to think of it story now because I know what it is, but my mind's going blank. But anyway, I'll probably come to me later after stream, and I'll punch myself knowing the story. Yeah. Good evening. Yeah, got 4 viewers, which is yeah. That's only one thing that's one thing I might do because I noticed last week and previous few weeks, viewership had gone down a bit in terms of streams because I think it did because I don't think I promoted them enough. So I learned my error there. So nice to see some more people tuning in. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, cheers. I'll just head. I'm going to be I'm going to go off for a minute. I just need to get myself some water because I've run out. So I'll be silent for a minute and I'll be back in short while. Oh no, not to worry. I know Wrong Tail Wu is I know he's been absent as well because of his studies as well. So don't you don't have to apologise. I just yeah. One thing I will say to people to anyone listening, if you notice any sort of slight silences, it'd be because my lips are getting dry. So that'll be why. So yeah, Shiloh, yeah, it very much is a victory, and really, it goes understated how much this saved Grant, because had he lost it, he would have been sacked. Because Grant and McClellan, Halleck and McClellan were scheming to get rid of him, and had they done so, I think, I don't think it would have changed the outcome of the war, but it would have gone on far longer if Grant was removed at this point in the war, because I would say very much it was Grant that defeated the South alongside. I mean, Grant and Sherman were the ones who defeated the South, and I see, and I think Grant was one of the few people who could actually lead the Union war effort on a military level, because Abraham Lincoln was a great political leader, but he isn't a military guy, and Grant was the only guy that Lincoln could depend upon in the later events of a civil war. In 1864 to 65, where Lincoln agrees not to constantly interfere, because this is one thing that happens a lot, is Lincoln constantly interferes to the detriment of his generals, and it's one of those things where even George Henderson, for example, in his book about Stonewall Jackson, will write about the evils of civilian control of an army at times, and so with that, at first there was no pursuit of the Confederate forces, which Grant at first he understood. Yeah, look, we can't. They're in no position to pursue because at the end of the day, they are not in a good prime position. However, after a certain time, as you get into May and so on, it's really at this point. It's really at this point where Grant is livid, almost, where he's saying, "Why aren't we advancing?" Because the Confederates must be all on the back foot. We must press our advantage. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I know. I know drummer because I remember there was some drummer boys. There was one drummer boy, which I forgot if I mentioned it on my William T. Sherman stream, especially in part two. But there was a drummer boy who was actually he actually got a free ticket to the Naval Academy in Annapolis in Maryland. Yeah, because he served under Sherman quite capably. And the thing about drummer boys as well was they were like average 12 years old. Because I mean, in the Napoleonic Wars, I mean, famously the Battle of Waterloo, there was that time where you had Huguenot stormed, and of like hundreds of Frenchmen who attacked at one point in the battle. There's a famous painting with the axeman, and it's actually depicted in Sharp. Yeah, yeah, you just have a situation where the drummer boy is the only one to live because basically the soldiers would take pity on him. 6 years old, I don't know. I didn't think they'd be that young. I know, like 12 years because Grant Grant actually ended up taking his 12-year-old to the Vicksburg campaign, like his 12-year-old son Frederick, to a campaign, but not in any military capacity, of course. But yeah, it's it was a different time, I suppose you could say. Yeah, so I didn't know 6 years old though. I knew 12 years old, or perhaps even 10, because you think a lot of midshipmen you get in Master and Commander film. Yeah. So yeah, you have in the direct aftermath of Shiloh, Grant is banging the drum saying we need to pursue our advantage. We need to go against Corinth. We could do with going down to Vicksburg, taking all the Mississippi River ports. Because one thing that Grant also agrees with, because Lincoln knew this from day one, but it's only really in 1864 onward, especially, where you get what's called the Anaconda Plan. Because Winfield Scott, he believed that the only way to win one of the main ways to win the Civil War was you have to take you have to blockade the South. Now, the problem with that is it's legally sketchy. Yeah, it was legally sketchy because how can you blockade your own country? Because Lincoln's formerly legal position was, well, we are fighting to restore the Union, and it's not the states that are in rebellion, but the people within most states. So if you hold the precept that the states themselves haven't rebelled and they're not a legitimate country, how can you blockade yourself? And yeah, there's a lot of legal quandaries throughout this entire war. Well, that's follow my dad's or when it was. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. So yeah, it's been a while. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's obvious, of course. Yes, probably should fall back. Yeah. But anyway, um, so yeah, it's not until later on you get them bearing down upon. It's not until October. It's not until September time. Yeah, it's like because later on you do get them advancing into into Corinth. But the problem was, yeah, it was like. However, you do have because the thing about Corinth was, so you see like a railway here, like goes through Decatur, Huntsville, through Chattanooga, and then through Chattanooga goes into Georgia and goes through Georgia, goes into Virginia. So you get certain places like Chattanooga and Corinth, which become battlefields, basically because that's just how important they are as railway junctions. So yeah, you have Grant. It takes months for the Union Army to exploit their advantage from Corinth, basically because Henry Halleck just dithers. And this is the thing where J.C. Fuller, like, he gets really scathing about Henry Halleck, and I don't blame him because I would be so in his situation because you are looking at Henry Halleck. He's spaffing away an advantage that was bloodily gained at Shiloh, and he's not exploiting it to the fullest. Why? Basically, yeah, he was a bookish kind of guy. Like because the thing about Henry Halleck was, if I can find it, I don't think I've got a quote. But yeah, the thing about Henry Halleck was he's very much a guy who, if you ask him questions about Napoleon's campaigns, for example, it's worth noting Henry Halleck actually translated a 4-volume biography of Napoleon from French into English for example. So that's kind of where Henry Halleck's strengths lie. Is that he's very good at telling you what past generals have done, but as Joseph Fuller, for example, will himself say in his own book, look, generalship relies mainly upon instinct. You can learn all you can in a book, but reading in a book is very different from commanding troops out in the field. Grant understood this, which is why he doesn't. Grant wasn't the kind of guy who could tell you the skinny about what Napoleon did in 1806 or what he did in the Russian campaign, but he understood the value of logistics. He understood the value of initiative, of pursuing the enemy. He understood all the ingredients of war needed to succeed, and that's the main difference between Grant's success versus Henry Halleck and his procrastination ways. So, yeah, that's what happens. Yeah. Now, not long after taking Corinth, later on you do get Sterling Price and Earl Van Dorn. They go and try and take back Corinth. They try to meet up, but Rosecrans and Grant, guiding guys like Rosecrans, make sure to frustrate any sort of meeting up of you. And it's like you have, for example, as you can see, May 29th, Beauregard and Bragg, they retreat further south. This is where Beauregard gets removed and Bragg replaces him, which, well, if anyone's read that Samuel Watkins book, you know why Braxton Bragg was so hated by his men as the war progressed. So this is phase one of the Iuka Corinth campaign. So yeah, you have Sterling Price, who battles around 10 of Iuka on September 19th, because he was on his way to meet up with Earl Van Dorn, who was advancing up a Mobile, Ohio railroad. He was meant to, I think, he was meant to meet around between Glendale and Stanley, around this area, then march upon Corinth to try and retake it from Grant. But Grant was shrewd enough to know defeat in detail, basically. So that's where, Then you have, and then you have Earl Van Dorn. He hears of Price's defeat, and you later have a battle on October 3rd into the 4th, Corinth. Even though Rosecrans does defeat these two Confederate armies, he doesn't exploit his advantage. And the thing about Rosecrans was, well, so I'll go off so I'll go off Ron Chernow description of him because I think it's apt. For all that, Rosecrans, he's very charismatic, and his men they called him Old Rosie because he had ruddy cheeks, and he's a very charismatic kind of guy, and he was a very warm guy, very pure in motive and action, as Grant would describe him. However, he was also weak-willed, vain, and irresolute, lacking Grant's superlative drive and focus, a terrible procrastinator that constantly clamored for troops. At Chickamauga, later on, he behaved with such shocking cowardice as he fled the battlefield, and even Lincoln sneered. He was confused and stunned like a duck hit on the head. And I will say, as a bit of a defense of Rosecrans, not long before Chickamauga, he saw one of his mates, one of his close friends, get his head taken off by a cannonball. So when Rosecrans freezes and is completely mentally broken by the Battle of Chickamauga later on, where he loses to Bragg, I'm willing to think that Rosecrans went through similar things to what John Bell Hood went through with his wounds, which was PTSD, not the same man. And how many men are the same again when you see when you see one of your better friends' heads taken off by a cannonball? I don't know many people who would do that. Yeah, pretty much. It's like as I'll detail later, the Confederate troops defending Chattanooga, Missionary Ridge. Had they had a better diet, they could have held on a lot better against Grant and Sherman and Hooker. in latter end of 1863. So I'll mention that later on. Yeah. So yeah, as a short, yeah. So you get. So this is where Sterling Price he crosses West Indian Creek, goes along Bay Springs Road, and fights against Rosecrans, who's advancing up, which is into Road. The thing is, yeah, you get like for example, you got Moa's troops, which had for example Moa been dispatched to Bay Springs Road, he could have cut off Martin's retreat at least. He could have tried to carve up the Union Army into pieces, but Rosecrans he just dithered, and yeah, victory cannot be total. It's worth noting, Grant he will say, look, the objectives of that Iuka-Corinth campaign from a Union perspective was, A, you do not allow Van Dorn and Sterling Price to meet up, which was achieved, and B, you make sure Corinth doesn't fall, which again, that was achieved. So, yeah, it's very much a matter of, even though Rosecrans could have done a lot better in his handling of his battles, it's a matter of, yeah, this is really a matter of, well, yeah, I don't really. It's still a matter of, well, he still won the battle, and as you can see here, you got Van Dorn, your Price does eventually meet up with him later on, but yeah, it's a matter of armies, they're not the size they could have been. So yeah, it's a matter of, and you got Cornfield, you got outer lines, mainly rifle pits. I mean, you got more here who, and then yeah, it's one weird thing is Kossuth Road here, which that's actually named after a Hungarian revolutionary, which I don't know, it's a bit weird, but I suppose yeah, America being a sort of more liberal country at the time, I suppose yeah. Suits well that we might have a road named after some obscure, well, I say obscure in relative terms because I imagine Hungarians know of him, but average Westerner, such as myself, by and large, don't really know much of him. But anyway, yeah. So yeah, this is what happens at the Battle of Corinth, and yeah, and then yeah, and it was really a matter of with this battle, it could have been handled a lot better. I won't go into too much detail because this is not Grant's battle, although Rosecrans was acting on sort of instructions of Ulysses Grant. So yeah, this is Sterling Price. I think he's one of a few Union generals I can think of who doesn't have a beard at all that I can see. This is Earl Van Dorn. Thing about him was later on in the war, he gets killed off by a guy because he was sleeping with this other man's wife, and the husband killed him. So yeah, I suppose it's a matter of don't sleep with another man's wife. I suppose would be the lesson of that one. And then Mrs. William S. Rosecrans or Old Rosie. You can tell. I think that's a Freemason thing about it, because I know Napoleon did it. The whole thing about putting your hand underneath your coat like that. So, I didn't think they still did that by the time of the Civil War, because I know Napoleon and others did it. But apparently that's meant to show some calm and cool leadership, which is kind of ironic with Rosecrans. So yeah, not long after. So after Corinth is secured and Earl Van Dorn's forces are forced back into retreat, this is where Grant goes on the Vicksburg campaign. And I will say, without hyperbole, I think the Vicksburg campaign was the best military campaign of a civil war, certainly by Grant. But I will say, of the military campaigns to be studied in the American Civil War, the Vicksburg campaign has to be the superlative one to be studied. A second one would, of course, be Shenandoah Valley campaign by Stonewall Jackson. And yeah, but the thing about Stonewall Jackson's campaign is, it feeds into the 7 days battles, and that, it's a matter of, it's very subjective as to the question, which campaign would you consider the best? But I would say Vicksburg for obvious reasons, because it split the Confederacy in half, but also helped to contribute massively to the end of the war. Whereas the Shenandoah Valley campaign, if the Confederates won the war, then we would be talking about Shenandoah Valley campaign with far more glowing terms than we do in this timeline in the event of a Confederate victory in the Civil War. So I suppose it's a matter of subjective based upon like circumstances you get in the timeline. So yeah. So yeah, as you can see, the Vicksburg campaign. So initially, Grant was marching down a more northerly direction, like he was going down like sort of Mississippi Central Railway to get at Vicksburg. But basically, what happens was he's marching halfway through here, and meanwhile, you have Sherman. He was also meant to attack from this side and then Chickasaw Bayou, but he gets repelled in the latter end of December. So yeah, on December 20th, as you can see here, this key here, Holly Springs, Earl Van Dorn raids it, and well, that's all of Grant's supplies destroyed. However, there was one discovery that Grant makes was that in the countryside, there's plenty of supplies to be taken, like food, like hogs and meat to be taken from. So in effect, you can live off the land. Now, so in the latter part of the Vicksburg campaign, as you get into the new year, this is where Grant he starts planning for times where he might have to go off his supply lines a bit. Now he has to do this despite protests from Henry Halleck above him and Sherman below him, because Henry Halleck, being a very much sort of a military rules kind of guy, very much a stickler by the rules, refuses to countenance a scenario where you might have to scrub up a rule book a bit and think outside the box. While Sherman, he's beginning to learn in his own way about how to conduct the war, but it's really the Vicksburg campaign where he learns how much he can actually live off the land. So the Vicksburg campaign, in a way, you can say really is a sort of apprenticeship for Sherman in his eventual march to the sea. And yeah. So yeah. So yeah. As you can see at point 4, McClernand, one thing McClernand does meanwhile, when Grant and Sherman are doing their thing, McClernand is scheming to try and get his own command to undercut Grant. And because he's a political general, he's able to get his way. But later on, it's around this time you get into January, like Halleck does actually say to Grant, look, if you want to get rid of McClernand at any given point, you have my permission. Like you have my tacit approval if you wish to get rid of McClernand. But because McClernand has friends in high places, he can't get rid of him just yet. He has to wait for McClernand to land himself in deep crap later on, which is mainly like May and June time. But Grant already knew by this point that McClernand had to go, but he needed a damn good excuse. He needed a damn good reason because McClernand is on friendly terms with the president, although that's waning because Lincoln very much likes Grant and McClernand's frustrating him. McClernand takes his place to go Arkansas Post, which I think he gets something like 1,400 casualties, or like 4,000, or perhaps even the highest 4,000 casualties. I could do checking, but I'll probably perhaps check. I might correct myself after the stream if I'm indeed wrong about either of those. But basically, yeah, he takes a lot of casualties for a place that's strategically not all that useful to the Vicksburg campaign. So yeah. So yeah, it's around this point where Grant he actually makes a request to he communicates with Henry Halleck, who says to him, "You have command of all troops along this entire sector along Mississippi, like the Department of the Mississippi, as well as, which also includes Arkansas. All troops are under your, not Arkansas. At least this period, Arkansas, I should say, not all of Arkansas, because Trans-Mississippi Theater is a different theater. But Grant pretty much has control over all forces within this area. So McClernand is undercut. So McClernand was raising troops only to have himself cooked by Grant and Halleck going against him. So yeah. Now, Grant, he can't get it from a northerly direction through like the Yazoo River way. So what he does then is later on he pivots more towards this side, through Lake Providence, and around here. So, for example, you got Grant's Canal, as you can see. So, from late January to late March, he gets his men digging a lot of canals to connect all the bayous and streams and creeks and so on. It's a bit of a long shot, but he's having to think outside the box a bit because Vicksburg is a very tricky. It's very strategically well located. I'll I think. Yeah, here it is. Yeah, so Vicksburg, for example, when you see how the river curves. So, for example, the Navy can't take it because the Navy did actually take New Orleans and most of Louisiana back in May 1862. However, Vicksburg, the Navy tried to take it under Farragut, but they were repulsed. And I mean, I'm quite scathing towards that in hindsight, but no, because I'm reading about it going, well, it's the same as Gallipoli in the sense that the Navy trying to make that attempt. Well, what happened was you eventually just alerted John C. Pemberton over to the fact of, well, you've alerted John C. Pemberton. I'll see if I can. To the fact that the Union are gunning for for that city. This is John Clifford Pemberton. The only reason I'm pointing this here because there's actually two John Pembertons of this time. You've got John Clifford Pemberton, as pictured here, and then you got a guy called John Stiff Pemberton, who was the guy who created Coca-Cola. And apparently, some people who study the Civil War they get confused between the two. So I thought that was just a short detour on the topic of who's commanding the Confederate garrison in Vicksburg. Now, it's worth noting around Jackson, around Mississippi, you've got a guy called you got Joseph E. Johnston commanding troops there. The problem you've got for the Confederates is that Jefferson Davis, he doesn't like Joseph E. Johnston, but he does like John C. Pemberton. But Pemberton is not a field commander. He's more of a build for fortifications kind of guy. A lot of, like, for example, Fort Wagner and other places like that were built by him. So Pemberton, he's very skilled at building fortresses, but he's not very good at actually doing field command. And it's also worth noting that Pemberton was actually a Pennsylvanian. So one thing that motivates him to hold on as long as he does in Vicksburg is that he doesn't want to be seen as a coward, and certainly not as a Northern sympathizer. So he does some very foolish actions in this campaign, but it's understandable when you factor that he feared the idea of being stigmatized as a Northern coward, fighting, similarly go against the South if he were to surrender. But that's the way things are, yeah. And yeah, so yeah, later on, so you have, for example, you have Fort Pemberton, which gets attacked as Union troops. They go through here across for the Yazoo to get over to Fort Pemberton. Yeah, but as I said, the northern approach is not doable because and as Sherman, for example, found in the hard way, Chickasaw Bayou, yeah, it's just not doable. So yeah, and Grant's digging a lot of canals, which is very much of a long shot, and they don't really work. But at least it keeps his men busy because one thing Grant knows is that you kind of need something to keep your troops busy in winter because otherwise they just get bored. Yeah, I've seen the film Glory, so yeah, I understand. I mean, I think the only reason that fortress fell anyway was because the sheer number of dead bodies poisoned the water. It wasn't so in a morbid way. The attackers actually did get what they wanted, just in a very more morbid way of accomplishing that end. So yeah, sort of the ironies of war for you. But yeah, you can't fault John C. Pemberton for that one. He certainly is very good at building fortifications. I still don't know where he gets a Wagner name from, because it's not from Wagner as the famous composer. So yeah, but yeah, so I've already shown that. Yeah. Now, one thing that happens on April 16th is so as you mentioned it, yeah, because of the way the river curves, ships have to slow down around a bend, which is why you get these coastal batteries around here are just completely deadly towards any Union ships. However, they are commanding along certain bluffs, which is why one thing that Grant and David Dixon Porter, the rear admiral in this area, they do what they do is they go right because you see here underneath you see the bluffs where they ride just below the bluffs where they can't depress the guns low enough to shoot at the Union ships, and the Confederates, they've got these bales of cotton they use to light up the night to help them see better because this is a time before like stuff like night vision and other inventions of that sort. So you're having to burn like bales of cotton, and also the Union gunboats, they've got bales of cotton on uh, on their on the tops of the ships to help deflect any shells. I think only one Union gunboat actually sinks for the entire thing, whereas the rest of them get through. Only like 14 guys are wounded. No one gets killed for this audacious sort of escapade where you have Porter's flotilla just wheeling past Vicksburg. And, oh, bloody hell. Where is it? Yeah, so this is the thing. So, I forgot to. Yeah, I forgot to attach the second half of the campaign. But yeah, anyway, so in May 1863, Grant is looking for a southern way to get to Vicksburg. He's going to get between. His plan now is to get. He's going to go through New Carthage and cross somewhere around here, and go over to. At first, his intention is to hug along the river, but once he realizes how much he can live off the land, he's going to try and go more inland against the advice of Henry Halleck. So he gets his army across Bruinsburg, which he only knows of this because there's an escaped slave. I don't. The name wasn't given, but yeah, yeah, that was my way of putting it for Fort Wagner. Yeah. So yeah, thing about Bruinsburg was the only way Grant knew about it was because of an escaped slave who actually told him it was actually doable to cross there, and there were no Confederate troops in the area. The nearest one's at Port Gibson, but that's like you're talking like between 5 and 10 miles away from Bruinsburg. So yeah, there were plans to meet up with Nathaniel P. Banks from Louisiana around Natchez, but Nathaniel P. Banks he's setting up for a Red River expedition, and in a way that's kind of fortuitous for Grant because Nathaniel P. Banks, as a political general who got himself outsmarted by Jackson a number of times, he would because he outranked Grant at this particular point, it would have derailed the Vicksburg campaign to have had Nathaniel P. Banks commanding instead of Grant. So it's fortuitous that doesn't happen that way. And yeah, so they cross at Bruinsburg in the space of 24 hours. It's something like 22,000. 22,000 troops cross in the space of 24 hours. The largest amphibious operation done in American history, right up to D-Day. Very much of a, nothing large had been done up to that point. I mean, Veracruz, where Winfield Scott invaded into Mexico, was done with 12,000 men. This was over double that, and even meant I think Grant had somewhat 40 to 50,000 men in total for the entire campaign. So you have factor 40 to 50,000 men going across the river in short order. I mean, there's a battle at Port Gibson where the Confederate forces forced to flight. Meanwhile, this is one thing worth noting, Sherman was actually tasked with doing a feint attack, while a guy called Benjamin Grierson was in charge of doing a cavalry raid, similar to what Nathan Bedford Forrest would do in his campaigns. So Grierson raids all over sort of areas of deep south, like into Louisiana and southern Mississippi, as well as into areas of Alabama, in order to throw off Pemberton. and it really works. These two feints, north and south, throw off Pemberton for thinking where Grant is going to strike. So when Grant does finally get to, because one thing Grant ends up doing is he gets right up between Vicksburg and Jackson, and his main priority at this point is to prevent Joseph E. Johnston and John C. Pemberton from meeting up. Johnston does get word over to Pemberton saying, "Meet up with me around somewhere like here, like near northeast of a place called Champions Hill, which is halfway between Vicksburg and Jackson." But the problem was Jefferson Davis gives John C. Pemberton a set of orders saying, "You must hold that town to the end, to the bitter end." Whereas Joseph E. Johnston is like saying, "No, don't do that." But because Joseph E. Johnston doesn't have supreme authority in that neck of the woods, that sort of command and control isn't possible. So, yeah, this is where Jefferson Davis, in my view, gets rightful blame for this part of the war, because he screwed over the command structure. Had Joseph E. Johnston been in charge of all of this, I think the campaign would have gone a lot better, because the combined Confederate forces between Johnston and Pemberton was something like 60,000. So they outnumbered Grant's forces, and Johnston, being a very good guy for choosing a solid defensive ground, would have defeated Grant, I reckon, or at least brought him enough of a bloody nose to make the campaign painful. Although it's worth noting as well, you got to temper that with the fact that Vicksburg would have been surrendered in the event of John C. Pemberton doing what Johnston wanted him to do. So it's kind of one of the things where Vicksburg being strategically important on a geographical basis. But then again, Johnston is also thinking, well, we cannot risk losing an entire army of 30,000 men. It just getting bottled up in Vicksburg. So both perspectives, I feel, have validity. And yeah, I'm minded to agree more with Joseph E. Johnston, personally, although Pemberton does have, and Davis did have a point in defending Vicksburg as well. So anyway, you have at first you have a battle of Champions Hill, where the battle is won by Grant. However, McClernand screws up by not pursuing enough. Basically, he's too overcautious, and there was a position where Pemberton's army could have been completely obliterated, but McClernand, being overcautious, screwed up that plan, and they're able to retreat to Vicksburg in good order. However, not long after, they do besiege. They do end up besieging the city of Jackson. Johnston has to retreat because he's not got nowhere enough men to defend Jackson, which is a state capital of Mississippi, of course. So when you factor Baton Rouge, which has already fallen, as well as Nashville beforehand, Jackson is now the third state capital to fall to the Union armies. So yeah, very much a big kick in the balls for the Confederates. And yeah, it's really just a matter of, so once Jackson has fallen and Johnston is well away off, like he's somewhere around here between Jackson and Meridian, Grant is able to pivot back to Vicksburg, where he lays siege to it, and he invests it. At one point, he actually gets John Logan, one of his supporters. Actually, I don't know too much about him, but I've heard he's one of the best. He's probably the best political general of the entire Civil War, which has high praise from some source I've heard. One source I heard from about John Logan, but in that sense. And so John Logan was, if I can see here, yeah. So he had the idea of, because you think of a crater you get in the Overland campaign, and famous in that Cold Mountain film. Something like that was attempted here at Vicksburg, where John Logan's men, they tried to explode some mines underneath the Confederate lines on the Jackson Road outside Vicksburg. It did succeed at first in terms of throwing a lot of, in terms of unbalancing the Confederate forces in the area. But if there's anything you can say about the Confederate army, is that they are really good at defense, especially under John C. Pemberton, who's very good at building fortifications. So the Union armies get chucked back, and this is comparative to the attack on Cold Harbor, which I will talk about next week. Uh, yeah, Cold Harbor was very much a bloody assault, and it was really a matter of Grant regretted it in the same way that he regretted this. He thought, in hindsight, he looked upon this and he thought it was too hasty. Like he believed the Confederates to be too much in a bad position than what actually were, and he learned it the hard way. But as I said, like it's you got factor Grant is working on a maxim of to advance is to conquer. So, and I don't want to say caught of the offensive, but because I mean the thing about because it's only because of the First World War the idea is ridiculed, but the caught of the offensive is very much a valid idea because well he who attacks has the initiative, and God knows having the initiative means you have to decide the terms of when battles are fought and how X, Y, and Z are done. It's just perfectly blind science. I mean, you can't say it was overdone in the First World War, but of all the things to have a go at, have a go at Grant for, that's not one of them. And indeed, you get this is Siege of Jackson, as mentioned earlier, which there's not really much to be said. It was just stormed mainly by under Sherman, who was detached. So this is another sort of painting of the Vicksburg assault, which notice as well that I believe that guys are throwing a grenade, which I mean I know that grenades weren't really the thing about grenades was they weren't really common like in the way that we think of them, and it's certainly like you think of, for example, the grenadiers of the Napoleonic Wars, but weren't really grenadiers in terms of throwing grenades, whereas the grenades you get here, it's kind of like little bombs in a sense, and that they're very much, and Confederates make use of them a lot in siege defense with great effect, and this assault happens. I think that's the only scene of that film I've actually watched. The other scene I've watched is you got Killian Killian Murphy and you got Natalie Portman in another scene. But I haven't watched that film actually in ages. But I remember that scene from The Crater. Very much. I would not want to be a Union soldier in that scenario. The Overland Campaign was a nightmare, and there's a reason why people do not say that is Grant's finest hour, to say the least. So on July the 4th, Vicksburg surrenders, and the thing was, John C. Pemberton, he makes this, he does a surrender on the erroneous promise that he thinks that, on the erroneous idea that because it was done on Independence Day, that Grant is somehow going to be more lenient with him. Well, the surrender is itself lenient, but that's because, well, Grant is already having to operate behind his supply lines. To a certain extent, he can't afford to have to deal with tens of thousands of prisoners, so he just paroles them. Now, some of those prisoners later, they do end up being conscripted into the Battle of Chickamauga. And this is one thing Sherman comments on in his personal memoirs, which is why later on in the war, he's a lot more merciless in terms of his approach with stuff like the March to the Sea, as well as the Atlanta campaign. So, So the Vicksburg campaign ends, and this is the thing. Like, I suppose the two main ingredients that really made sure Grant won this campaign was A, constancy of purpose, because he never changed like his intention. Like, he might have changed the methods, but he never changed the intention, which was to take Vicksburg. So very doggedly determined to take that city, and very much, and that's one of the main ingredients for his success. The other one would be the sort of ruthlessness to see it through, because if there's anything about a lot of Civil War generals, it's the fact that they might be good at organization or logistics, but they're terrible at the ruthlessness aspect of needing to fight a war effort. So yeah, and it's not just about, yeah, it's a matter of the Vicksburg campaign. I mean, I could do a detailed stream about it, to be honest, and do it more in better detail than what I've done here, haphazard as it is, because it certainly has to be the best military campaign in terms of all the ingredients of success, like good cooperation with the Navy, damn good, damn good, like damn good troops in terms of their discipline. You've got dogged determination, clear outset goals. You've got support from above, because Henry Halleck isn't stonewalling against Grant of this. He does criticize certain aspects of it, but Grant has a lot more autonomy compared to earlier campaigns. And yeah, I would handily say it has to be the best military campaign of a civil war, in my humble opinion, with second place going to the Shenandoah Valley campaign, and third place. I'm minded to say with third place, I'm minded to say Atlanta campaign. The only reason 7 days battles don't go there is because 7 days battles. There really a lot of hazard. There are really a lot of problems with that campaign. A lot of them were just outside of control of Lee and Longstreet and Jackson, but some other factors which they could have been mitigated with better communication, and that's why I think the 7 days battles gets a bit overblown, in my humble opinion, because it's like they suffer from the same errors as what Napoleon would suffer in 1813, where he hasn't got, because Napoleon famously he doesn't have cavalry in that particular campaign, and that suffers him lacking communication with elements of his armies, and communication becomes a lot more of a chore, and coordination becomes a lot less commonplace than in earlier campaigns, and it's just the same goes with his 7 days battles. Like, a lot of things went wrong. It's kind of one of those things where, yeah, a lot of things went wrong, but in spite of that, it went right in terms of what Lee accomplished his objectives. So that's why it's still a good military campaign, but I wouldn't say it's in my top three. So not long after Vicksburg, as he's securing his lines around Vicksburg and rebuilding railways and so on, and dealing with Nathan Bedford Forrest, among other things, Grant gets word that Rosecrans has been defeated at Chickamauga, and at this point he has to save the Union Army because they're besieged around the Chattanooga area. And you have this position where you do have Grant. He's having to speed along. It's worth noting that Grant actually suffered a horse riding accident in New Orleans, so he's got an injured leg. So there are times where on the approach to the Chattanooga area, he's having to be carried by his own men, which I certainly just tell you, because thinking about Ulysses S. Grant, he's not exactly the most charismatic guy ever. Like, he's a lot more humble and modest, but his troops adore him because he's very victorious, and they know full well that, contrary to the reputation there is of Ulysses Grant being this drunken, hard ass who was willing to butcher his own men, actually he was known to be quite shrewd in his deployment of troops. He was known to be almost like, there were times where apparently he was drinking, and he did have a guy called Rawlins beside him, which I know Shelby Foote makes mention of that guy in his books, especially in Shiloh that I've read thus far. I do plan on reading Shelby Foote's trilogy in June, so I'll be more competent to share anecdotes to talk about Shelby Foote by the end of June. But I would say without doubt that with Grant, he very much was loved and adored by his men, in the same way that Lee was, just in a slightly different way. So you have, they go up to the Chattanooga area. Hooker, for example, is serving under Grant around this time. He's on the Western Theater because after Chancellorsville, well, he gets taken out because basically after what happened with Chancellorsville, he's just taken out the Eastern Theater altogether. I need not go into more detail than that, but yeah. So upon the eve of Grant and Sherman coming upon Chattanooga area, you have Wheeler who starts raiding. So he got set off from Decatur here in northeastern Georgia or sort of like, I think it's like, I don't know if this is where North Carolina border meets. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a map now of Georgia. Yeah, so you got date. I mean, he goes through here. He does try to go against a supply economy, but gets repulsed, and then he decides to go around here, all the way over to Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Is a fairly and then you have. I will watch that scene later because I didn't know the name of him, so I will watch it later because I certainly will watch it later after the stream. So one thing Grant and Sherman have to do before they even fight against Bragg to begin with is that they need to secure their supplies. This is called a cracker line because basically it's biscuits. Is a crack because the main food that the Union troops were eating were these biscuits. They're having to eat them because the supply lines weren't ready yet, and they had to because originally they went through Bridgeport, through Jasper, along the river up here, through Crossroads, and you can imagine it takes a long time for supplies to happen this way because it's very rugged territory. This is along the Walden Ridge. They have so you have these. You have a battle of Brown's Ferry, which Brown's Ferry goes underreported in context of a campaign because through that Brown's Ferry battle, the supply lines are guaranteed. And actually, on the day that they win the battle, Grant says, "Okay, full rations for everyone from now on," and that's when the troops are all cheering. Meanwhile, if I can find a quote by Samuel Watkins, meanwhile, Samuel Watkins says the men on the Confederate side were looking sick, hollow-eyed, and heartbroken, living principally upon parched corn, which had been picked out of the mud and the dirt under the feet of officers' horses. And he also said, they were starved and almost naked, and covered all over with lice and cabbage and filth and dirt. So the massive differences between the Union and Confederate armies could not be starker, where the Union armies, yes, they had supply issues beforehand, but they've actually got full rations, and the troops aren't. The uniforms might be a bit dirtied up from dust, for argument's sake, but they're not completely naked like some Confederate troops are, where the uniforms are in tatters, and logistics of the Army of Tennessee under Bragg is just non-existent, and they're having to eat parched corn, which is similar to what happened with Stonewall Jackson's army. For example, when I mentioned that Stonewall Jackson, the Second Battle of Bull Run, his army is just going through the Union supplies at Manassas Junction because they just can't wait to eat all the bacon and all the beef and other food that the Union troops have got in plentiful supply. Whereas Bragg's forces never got to enjoy that luxury in this campaign. So, not much to be said of here. There's a battle of a place called Wauhatchie, which there was like a battle there where Longstreet goes up against Hooker, if I remember correctly. But stupidly, Bragg decides to dispatch Longstreet to go up into eastern Tennessee to besiege Ambrose Burnside, who at this time was also dispatched to the Western Theater, leading an army up in eastern Tennessee, because eastern Tennessee was a very Union loyal area. And you have so Bragg deprives himself of his best general in time for the Battle of Missionary Ridge. So this is a battle of Wauhatchie where it's mainly Herod, so Oliver Otis Herod, the same guy who served under Hooker at the Battle of Chancellorsville, the same Herod who got his arse handed to him by Stonewall Jackson's outflanking maneuver, because Herod commanded the right flank, full of German and Dutch troops that got the arse handed to him by Stonewall Jackson, of course. And then so that's what happened with no choosing. I mean that's the thing. I remember George Henderson in his book about Stonewall Jackson. George Henderson being a British Army officer from the 1890s. He said basically, if Jefferson Davis got 200,000 more boots, he would have done more good for the Confederate cause than getting like 20,000 rifles through Wilmington Port, which I'm minded to agree with that because one thing that constantly dogs, because that's one common source of desertion for the Confederate troops was they just didn't have good boots for most of their men, for a good portion of their troops, and also starvation, rations, and they. I was seeing some quotes, so I might see if I can find it here. So Winfield Scott says that Southern troops have far better dash, as he would say, like a far better like so. So he says of the Southern troops, Winfield Scott said they have elan, courage, woodcraft, consummate horsemanship, endurance of pain equal to the Indians, but they will not submit to discipline. They will not take care of things or husband of their resources. Where they are, there is waste and destruction. If it could be done by one wild, desperate dash, they would do it, but they cannot stand the waiting. The Northerners, however, can wait. They can bear discipline. They can endure forever. Losses in battle are nothing to them. They will fight to the bitter end. I mean, I yeah, yeah, yeah. That's the thing, isn't it? Like you can't really march because I mean, boots. Of course, you can't march with them. This is one thing that dogs, Stonewall Jackson's army, for example, through his Valley campaign, was constant straggling because men would just go out looking for boots, and it's just, and you can't really march without uniform either because, well, imagine when it's raining, for example, as it did, for example, in the days leading up to the Battle of Missionary Ridge, around November 20th. It actually was raining, so I wouldn't want to be one of those Confederate soldiers on the high ground having to deal with the rain. So and as to that quote by Winfield Scott, I mean, I can imagine in the context of a battle, sure, but in context of a campaign, I mean, the Southern troops have been proven to endure a lot. Like the Southern troops. I mean, when you look up because it's like when when Confederate troops march into Pennsylvania, for example, or before that in Maryland, in the lead up to Antietam, you have you have Northern locals who would comment that they never saw a filthy army from the Southern armies that were marching their way. And that's the thing. Like Confederates were not good at logistics, to say the least. Yeah, but that's actually true. Henry Heath did charge into Gettysburg because he underestimated the defenses in the area, and he thought he was just going to get some boots for his men, which I thought was fair enough. But he didn't communicate with Lee effectively, and didn't follow Lee's orders to the letter. So the rest is history, as I say. And they go, So, for anyone not to know, this is Braxton Bragg with thick eyebrows, and very much he had. I think he must have been. I think he was descended from Scots because he had an irascible temper, and he was actually such a stickler for the rules that actually, one time when he was in a pre-Civil War fort, during antebellum era, he was a second commanding officer in a fort, but also a quartermaster. So he made a report. So he made a request for supplies to the quartermaster, i.e., himself. And then, as a quartermaster, he rebuked the commanding officer who requested the supplies himself. So even his commanding officer would just say to him, like, you are so eager to get into everyone's bad books that you even started fighting yourself. And that's kind of what Braxton Bragg was like. It's so humorous that he even started to have logistical, like paper work kind of quarrel with himself. And this is one from where you've got Patrick R. Claiborne, who I will do a stream about him at some point because he's a very interesting character, and very tragic figure, especially in terms of Battle of Franklin, which I've mentioned before on the Nathan Better Forest stream. So that's the Battle of Waxahachie. So you have here the Battle of Missionary Ridge. I don't know. Let's see if. So this is this is what Missionary Ridge looked like, and you can see like there would have been puddles like this because you got like rifle pits and foxholes dug, and there was rain in the preceding days leading up to the battle. So I wouldn't want to be the Confederate troops with pretty much no clothes, like wearing filthy rags if anything, dealing with the rain peppering upon you there. Yeah, and that's kind of like a sort of panorama, sort of, yeah, like with high ground and, yeah, very close fighting. Although it's worth noting that most battles in the Civil War were more rifle range fighting, like over a couple of 100 yards, rather than full on melee fighting. Like only like 1% of all casualties were done with a bayonet. And then this is a view from Lookout Mountain, which was on the left. So you have a battlefield on Lookout here. You got Smoky Mountains of North Carolina. You've got Atlanta. You've got Chickamauga Battlefield. You've got Missionary Ridge, all the way over along here. It's just very rugged ground that, when you look at the casualty figures afterwards, you really come to realize how solidly how much of a solid victory the Battle of Missionary Ridge truly was for the Union side, because they should have. Because as you can see, you got Missionary Ridge, you got Tunnel Hill, and you got around here you got Lookout Mountain, which is a very domineering site. The Confederates, yeah, they had complete eyesight over the Federal Army. However, the Battle of Missionary Ridge, there was poor positioning on the part of the Confederate troops, because they had rifle pits dug along here. So when, for example, actually, I'll wait until I mention the center attack. So yeah, so the original battle plan for Missionary Ridge on November 25th was Sherman on the left and Hooker on the right. They would attack, and the point was they would attack and get into and try and break the two flanks, and then Bragg would be forced to weaken his center to reinforce the flanks. In so doing, Grant would then send Thomas to attack for dead center. Now, George H. Thomas was a Virginian who stuck true to the Union, which that's, I think he's the only other Virginian other than Winfield Scott who stayed true to the Union, from what I know, because most Virginians, of course, like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, they stayed true to Virginia. And, you get some people living around today who will say, oh, well, George H. Thomas had no problem staying loyal to the Union, therefore why shouldn't Robert E. Lee have stayed loyal to the Union and fought against his own home state? And it's like, well, two things can be right. George H. Thomas isn't a villain for fighting for the Union against his own people of Virginia, in the same way that Robert E. Lee is not a villain for fighting beside his fellow Virginians against the Union. Like, it's just, a lot of people get the wrong. A lot of people seem. I'm not saying like anyone in my audience does that. I'm saying I know people, mainly sort of Reddit here crowd and people of that sort, who often do that kind of argumentation, which gets really annoying because it just ignores nuance and the sort of complicated times the American Civil War truly was. So yeah, Sherman, he has a right headache because, for one, he takes Gold Hill thinking he's taking Tunnel Hill. He erroneously communicates to Grant that he's taking Tunnel Hill when actually he hasn't. So yeah, you just have a series of errors are made here, but it's nonetheless, yeah. Sherman does eventually does his part of the battle, although Claiborne, really, he's very good at using the terrain, like very adept. I mean, he really does provide a good counter to Sherman for a long while. In the later part of the battle, however, Sherman eventually does take Tunnel Hill, and Tunnel Hill was kind of called that way because it's kind of like a gorge where you got like two ridges, and they've got kind of like they all kind of curve down into lower ground between them. It's like two steep ridges, and then between them is like a really deep, like flat land that almost acts like a ravine. That's why it's called Tunnel Hill. So you can understand why Tunnel Hill was such a real bitch to try and take for Sherman. Yeah. And also there is a railway tunnel around here as well. That's another reason why Tunnel Hill gets its name as well. And yeah, you get Seth Chickamauga Creek around here as well. So I will say Bragg chose his ground well, were not for the fact that he poorly positioned his forces here, because what happened was when Thomas launches his attack and it's worth noting George H. Thomas is more of a defensive general. Like, he's not really an offensive kind of guy. So he attacks the center, and the rifle pits, they get broken fairly quickly. The Confederate troops in the second line, as you can see here higher up the ridge, they can't fire because you've got their retreating comrades in front of them. They can't afford to fire unless they kill off their own men. So by the time the Union troops, are able to be fired upon, it's almost too late. They're just almost swarming across this second line, and not long after the battle soon goes badly. Meanwhile, here on the left flank, for Bragg, his forces dealing with Hooker, they're also on the retreat, and when Hooker is going against Breckinridge's left flank, it's at this point Bragg has to call a retreat, and Claiborne has to act as a rearguard at Ringgold Gap, where we will look around here on the map across Chickamauga Creek. Now, Claiborne does a really good, superb rearguard action fighting against Sherman. But the army wasn't destroyed because of Claiborne's superb rearguard action. Meanwhile, Braxton Bragg, and Samuel Watkins actually says in his book that he felt sorry for Braxton Bragg in context of the aftermath of his battle because he was a broken man. But I would say, well, Braxton Bragg, a lot of the problems with his own making, so I can't really feel much sympathy for him. I don't know if, for example, I don't know if other people such as Alabaster might agree with me, but I'd say that's my humble opinion about Braxton Bragg. He was the architect of his own demise here, and Jefferson Davis also. He really screwed over the Army of Tennessee by refusing to get rid of Bragg sooner, even when directly after Chickamauga, as mentioned in an earlier stream, Jefferson Davis was told pretty much to his face that Bragg had to go by guys on Longstreet and Breckinridge and Polk and Hardy and Clay and others. Yeah, so it's I just see it as this is where and when you look at the casualty figures for Chattanooga, it's something like I would see if I can find. I'm trying to think of a casual. I can't find the casualties from the top of my head, but like the casualty figures, it's something like, So, granted, you do have something like apparently just shy of 6,000 for the Union and just shy of 7,000 for the Confederates, which is worth noting that the Confederates were defending the high ground. I do think. It's an element. I'm speaking mainly from hindsight and also from an outsider's perspective. So it's all right. There's also an element of how much is it right for me to say, oh, I can feel this way towards Braxton Bragg when I'm living I'm living like over 150 years after the fact. 160 years after. In point of fact, actually, I should say, So like nearly 163 years after the fact. But that's just, I do think like one missed opportunity. I will say, because I do plan on doing a stream about John C. Breckinridge, because I think he was a very capable general. He was a political general. And I think he was probably the best political general I can think of for the Confederate side in terms of corps command. And it's a pity that he never got to be the leading general on the Western Theater, but he joined the Confederate side too late, and I think if John C. Breckinridge was in command of, let's say, the Western Theater after Johnston's death, or rather after Beauregard was replaced, I think the Western Theater would have gone, even if Grant had won the Western Theater, let's say, just through sheer grinding down the Confederates. I still think it would have been a lot more of a headache if someone like Breckinridge was in charge. And I think Breckinridge, he was a lot more flexible and shrewd in the way he handled his army and how he handled things. But, I do plan on doing a stream about Breckinridge alongside Claiborne at some point. I might do Claiborne in 2 weeks' time after I'm done with Grant, because I got the book about him. So might well get ready to read with Claiborne. And one thing, yeah, one people might ask. So just before uh, uh, I forget. So the main reason why, for example, between late October up until um, late November, the reason you don't see a battle between late October and late November is because basically logistics were an issue for Grant, and also the weather. And Sherman getting into position didn't like. Sherman took ages to get into position because of terrain and also the weather didn't help either. Although it's worth noting that Grant did reason fairly well that if the weather is being mispunishing upon us, imagine what it's doing for the Confederate troops on the ground. Yeah, yeah. I just think it's like, yeah. I mean, I mean, it's kind of like there's an element of if you serve as a soldier, you can kind of have a certain perspective around a general, regardless of how terrible he is, because you're a lot more mindful of how difficult his job is. Whereas me, as a sort of civilian, I can kind of think of, well, I can look at other facts 160 years on and just think, yeah, this guy should never been in command as long as he was. But this is where I blame Jefferson Davis a lot more because he should have gotten rid of him, and he did have opportunities to get rid of him, but he just refused it. But yeah, okay. Now this is Orchard Knob, which I don't think I can find on the map. Just Orchard Knob. I'm trying to think where it is. Hold on. Yeah, Orchard Knob. That's where Grant's headquarters pretty much was. So you imagine this is what Grant would have seen of a battlefield. So yeah, so they can't fault Grant for picking great ground, and yeah. So yeah, this is a state of play as you get into 1864, not long after Chattanooga campaign, where so Tennessee is fully secure, and the Mississippi River is also fully secure, and you also got this naval blockade in force, and you got Fort Fisher, for example, nearby Wilmington, which next week I will mention, for example, because Wilmington port, very important, because in the film, in the film Lincoln, it does talk about Wilmington port, how important it was, and it indeed was very important logistically because I don't know if I could do it as a separate topic for a stream, which is the blockade running that the Confederates do, because there's a lot of British sailors who are willing to help the Confederates. A lot of this is good money, but also because they felt it was kind of like they felt they were kind of living up to the sort of daunting audacity that the Elizabethan Sea Dogs were doing back in their heyday through the blockade running against the Union. So that's actually one thing that doesn't really get mentioned as much in terms of logistics of the Confederates, was that they depended a lot on Wilmington. Like Wilmington Port was very important towards, and when it does fall, it's a big reason why Appomattox Courthouse surrender happens, because Wilmington was a big supplier, especially for stuff like beef and other food, as well as ammunition and guns and so on for Lee's army. And yeah, so yeah, you get. I can see. Where is it? I'm trying to think. Where is but yeah, I couldn't find a. I suppose this is the best map I can use for railroads, but yeah, you can understand like why railroads are so important, and yeah. So anyway, back to the military campaigns. Yeah, fair hindsight, yeah, I should never be back. Yeah, I mean, personally, from what little I know, I mean, I'm going to be reading about him later on at some point, but from what I know about it thus far about the Western Theatre, it should have been John C. Breckinridge, but it's also worth noting John C. Breckinridge was a Southern Democrat ticket guy for 1860 election, so Davis probably thought he was going to be a political rival, but even then, I mean, Jefferson Davis knew his job was provisional; it wasn't meant to be long term. Because I know a stream I'm in to do later on this year will be about Alexander Stephens, because he that cornerstone speech where enshrines pretty much the Confederate states, and I'm planning on doing a series of streams or something along those lines about the Confederate States sort of home front, how their politics worked, in terms of how logistically they were able to supply their forces, topics of that sort. And you suddenly get two politicians like Alexander Stephens, Robert Toombs, Jefferson Davis, John C. Breckinridge, who I think John C. Breckinridge, I think he should have been put in charge of Western Theatre after Beauregard, or at the latest, he should have been put. I think after the loss at Perryville, after the loss of the Heartland offensive, Bragg should have been replaced and replaced with Breckinridge. I think if Breckinridge was put in charge of the Western Theatre, things go a lot differently in terms of battlefield outcomes, at the very least. Even if Breckinridge was still to lose to Grant, it would certainly be a lot more of a headache because Breckinridge was far better at getting on with generals, and he probably would have had a far more capable strategy and far better logistics. Because this is one thing where when Breckinridge was Secretary of War in the latter stages of the Civil War in 1865, Breckinridge does a lot of army reforms that actually do a lot to keep a army of Northern Virginia fighting as long as it actually did, especially in logistical terms. But it was a matter of, it's kind of Albert Speer for the German war effort in World War II. It's kind of like, well, it did a lot of good, but the war was unwinnable. And I think the same could be said for my hypothetical scenario of John C. Breckinridge being in charge of a Western theatre in the scenario I envisage. But as I said, I will plan to do a stream about him later this year alongside Patrick R. Claiborne. So yeah. Anyway, not long. So yeah, when you get into 1864, so March 1860, because it's well done, winter, nothing happens because it's a pretty bad time to do a campaign for obvious reasons. So nothing really much happens up until March 1864, where Grant gets promoted over to lieutenant general. Where I might see if I can find what was that boomer moment from over? Yeah, so this is Grant in 1864, where he's promoted, because you can see on the shoulder patch he's got 3-star general. This is where he's promoted to lieutenant general. It was actually passed by an act of Congress, if I remember correctly. So yeah, very well deserved, I would add. I think Grant was. I mean, I would favorably compare him to the likes of Belisarius in terms of his lack of political ambition, in this sense. Although Sherman did warn him, basically, because guys like Lincoln were greasing him up, and perhaps I'm being too ungenerous in saying greasing him up, but certainly they were saying, look, you might well have a career after the war because, as we know in our timeline, Grant ended up becoming president, but he did it more of a sense of duty rather than naked ambition, as compared to someone like Henry Halleck or John McClernand, who were just outright villains in how they behaved towards Grant. I mean, one thing that happened, and another enemy that Grant makes around this time that also bites him in the arse was Rosecrans, because Rosecrans does a lot of time spreading rumors that Grant was a drunkard, which was a lot of bull, basically. But yeah, the thing was, you just have this. But Rosecrans, it was a matter of Grant did say some fairly scathing words about him in context of a battle, in context of the Chattanooga campaign, which is why Rosecrans took it so badly. Not saying it was undeserved. It can be argued whether it was deserved because Rosecrans, I'd say is a mediocre general. He's not great, but he's not terrible. He's perfectly middling at best, like a comfortable mediocrity. More than anything, like he's not a dazzling genius. Like he's not an instinctual genius like Ulysses S. Grant was, and I believe that. So with Grant being promoted because the promotion was fully passed and fully and fully added and all the rest of it bureaucratically and all that process by March 9th, 1864. And from that point onward, Ulysses Grant would command all armies of the Union, with Sherman replacing him, taking his place in the Western Theatre, which I did do last week. For anyone interested in that, and yeah, next week I will be talking about the Overland campaign. Now, I will get talking a fair bit about Robert E. Lee in that one because I think it was VA and Gativa who was asking about if I'd be willing to talk about Robert E. Lee. I will talk about Robert E. Lee a fair bit next week because the Overland campaign, you can't go with the Overland campaign without mentioning Robert E. Lee because there are certain anecdotes and moments for that campaign that, to my mind, even if I don't rate Lee as the greatest general of the Civil War for the Confederate side, I certainly do think he was probably the best leader of men in terms of his personality. Like he's very, I probably would say he was probably because apparently he did not look upon his nickname of Granny Lee as an insult because he very much was like a grandfather of his troops, and yeah, I do, and there's a lot of heartwarming anecdotes where, for example, the one Union general who graduated the same year as Robert E. Lee, who was at Appomattox, who helped him. He said to Robert E. Lee, "I will help you in any way I can," and Robert E. Lee just says, "God bless you, sir." And it's a matter of. So yeah, next week I'll do I'll do Grant in terms of his time commanding all Union armies in the remainder of the Civil War. I don't know how much I'll talk about his presidency because I don't know much there is to say about it in the grand scheme of things, other than to say there was just a great deal of corruption and Grant was incredibly trusting. Yeah, and I'll just say, and I'll just reiterate my assessment of him, which is to say that he just strikes me as the American version of the Duke of Wellington. Great general, but poor politician. And there's a reason why his presidency is very middling at best. But yeah, I think over my lifetime, over the past 25 years, Grant's reputation has been steadily been building up. Yeah, I think it was I think his sons got involved with a guy nicknamed Napoleon of Finance, and well, he lost all his money through that, I believe. Yeah, so it really was just a matter of Grant. He this is the main cardinal sin of Grant was he's too trusting of people. He just didn't, he always liked to see the good in everyone, and it resulted in him getting taken advantage of so many times. But yeah, he was a good man, yeah, and certainly I would say, in much the same way that Robert E. Lee, the fact that Robert E. lived in the way he did kind of does a great honor to the history of America. I would also say U.S. Grant was also the same, and yeah, I know that, yeah, and I probably also might have a more enriched perspective as well when I eventually do get round to reading Shelby Foote's trilogy in June. So yeah, without further ado, I'll end the stream. I will put them sources after the stream, which are JFC Fuller's book about the generalship of Ulysses S. Grant, personal memoirs of Grant, and then Ron Chernow's biography. So without further ado, I'll end the stream here, and I'll see you all next week, same time, Friday. Love me speaking today. Friday, the 31st, at the same time, 9 p.m. British time. So that will all, and I'll be locked for stream. So go well.